Hey, amazing viewers! Thanks for clicking on Fiction Blue. Today's special feature is what if Harry used Legilimency on Vernon Dursley and forced him to confess his crimes to the police. Your support through likes, shares, and subscriptions helps us reach more story lovers around the world. Thank you for being part of this community. Now, let's escape into this wonderful story. Chapter 1. The breaking point. The summer heat pressed down on Privet Drive like a physical weight, shimmering above the pristine asphalt and wilting the meticulously maintained gardens. In the second bedroom of number 4, Harry Potter lay on his threadbare mattress, one arm flung across his forehead, the other holding open a battered library book. Sweat beaded along his brow despite the open window, which admitted no breeze, only the distant sounds of neighbors' sprinklers and children playing. The book, Advanced Cognitive Theories and Mental Disciplines, was far from typical summer reading for a 15-year-old boy. But Harry Potter was far from typical. The thin, dark-haired teenager traced a finger down the page, his green eyes narrowed behind his round glasses. The mind is not a book to be opened at will and examined at leisure, Harry read under his breath. Thoughts are not etched on the inside of skulls, to be perused by an invader, but with sufficient focus, one consciousness may indeed penetrate another. He closed the book with a soft thud and pushed himself up, wincing as his ribs protested. 3 days had passed since Uncle Vernon's last outburst, but the bruises remained, hidden beneath his oversized t-shirt. His wand lay concealed beneath a loose floorboard, tantalizingly close yet forbidden by decree of the Ministry of Magic. "Boy!" Vernon's voice thundered up the stairs. "Down here. Now." Harry closed his eyes, taking a deep breath before sliding the book under his mattress. This was his third summer since learning he was a wizard, and somehow, it was proving to be the worst yet. The combination of Aunt Marge's visit the previous summer, the lingering fury over Dobby's pudding incident, and the increasing nervousness about his kind had pushed Vernon Dursley to new heights of animosity. And after the events at the Triwizard Tournament, after Cedric's death and Voldemort's return, Harry had returned to Privet Drive more vulnerable than ever, with nightmares that left him screaming in the early hours. The Dursleys had not been sympathetic. "Boy!" "Coming, Uncle Vernon," Harry called back, his voice carefully neutral as he made his way downstairs. His uncle stood in the kitchen doorway, his massive frame nearly blocking the entrance entirely. His face was already an alarming shade of puce, his mustache quivering with barely suppressed rage. "Explain this," Vernon hissed, thrusting a piece of parchment toward Harry. Harry recognized Hermione's neat handwriting immediately and felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. In their rush to communicate after the traumatic end of term, none of them had been particularly careful about using normal methods of communication. "It's just a letter from school," Harry said carefully, reaching for it. Vernon snatched it back. "Delivered by one of those filthy birds, right through the open kitchen window. What if the neighbors had seen? And this parchment. Talking about that murderer who's after you." Harry stiffened. "I didn't ask her to write to me about that. We've put up with this abnormality for years," Vernon continued as if Harry hadn't spoken, his voice rising steadily. "Harboring you, feeding you, clothing you, and this is how you repay us. Bringing your freakish problems to our doorstep." Petunia appeared behind Vernon, her horse-like face pinched with anxiety. "Vernon, the windows are open, I don't care." Vernon bellowed, though he did lower his voice slightly. "This ends now. No more letters, no more owls, no more magic talk." He spat the word like it was poison. "And if I hear you've been spreading tales about us, I haven't told anyone anything about you," Harry interrupted, feeling a dangerous heat rising in his chest. "No one would be interested anyway." It was the wrong thing to say. Vernon's face darkened further, and he took a menacing step forward. "What's that supposed to mean, boy? That we're not good enough for your freakish friends to hear about? After all we've done for you?" Harry knew he should back down, knew from years of experience that engaging only made things worse. But something had broken inside him since watching Cedric die, since feeling the Cruciatus curse tear through his body, since seeing his parents' echoes emerge from Voldemort's wand. The fear that had kept him compliant had been replaced by something colder and harder. "You've done nothing for me except make it clear how unwanted I am," Harry said quietly. "You've never passed up an opportunity to remind me that I'm a burden, that my parents were worthless, that I'm a freak who doesn't deserve." Vernon's hand moved with surprising speed for a man of his size. The blow caught Harry across the cheekbone, snapping his head to the side and sending his glasses skittering across the polished floor. "Vernon!" Petunia gasped, though whether in shock or warning, Harry couldn't tell through the ringing in his ears. "You will not speak to me that way in my own house," Vernon hissed, grabbing Harry's collar and bringing his face close. "Your parents got themselves blown up because they were meddling with things no decent people would touch, and you're heading the same way. Now get out of my sight." He shoved Harry backward, hard enough that the boy stumbled and fell against the staircase. Without his glasses, Vernon was just a large, menacing blur, but Harry could perfectly picture the triumphant sneer on his uncle's face. "And no meals until you learn some gratitude," Vernon added, turning away. "Petunia, where's Dudley?" "We're going out for dinner." Harry felt along the floor for his glasses, finding them thankfully unbroken. He slid them on as Petunia answered something about Dudley being at a friend's house. Neither of them looked at Harry again as he climbed the stairs, his cheek throbbing and something far more painful clenching in his chest. Back in his room, Harry locked the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. The familiar mixture of anger, helplessness, and shame churned inside him. He'd survived Voldemort multiple times, faced a basilisk, driven off 100 Dementors, yet here, in the supposedly safe Muggle world, he was powerless against his own uncle. "No," Harry whispered to himself. "Not powerless. Never again." He moved to the loose floorboard and retrieved not his wand, but the book he'd been studying. For weeks, he'd been researching mind magic, driven by the strange connection he seemed to share with Voldemort and the disturbing dreams that had been increasing since the graveyard. What had begun as a desperate attempt to protect himself from mental intrusion had evolved into something else entirely. If he couldn't use his wand without triggering the trace, perhaps there were other forms of magic he could master, forms that the Ministry couldn't detect. Harry opened the book to a dog-eared page and began to read again, this time with renewed purpose. The next 3 days passed in a tense stalemate. Vernon had reinstated Harry's meal privileges, after a terse warning from Petunia about what those people might do if he starves, but dinner was a silent, hostile affair. Harry kept his head down, ate quickly, and retreated to his room, where he continued his studies. The book, borrowed from the local library's psychology section, wasn't explicitly magical. But combined with the snippets of information Harry had gleaned about legilimency from overheard conversations between professors, it provided a theoretical framework. Mental disciplines existed in both worlds, the magical version simply had more immediate, powerful effects. Harry sat cross-legged on his bed, eyes closed, focusing on his breathing as the book instructed. Centering the mind was the first step. For hours each night, he practiced clearing his thoughts, building a mental landscape, imagining barriers and passages between thoughts. Progress was frustratingly slow. Without practical instruction, Harry was feeling his way blind, never certain if the occasional strange sensations, a tingle down his spine, a momentary dizziness, meant success or were merely products of his imagination. On the fourth night, as Harry moved through his mental exercises, a sharp rap at his door broke his concentration. "Dinner," came Aunt Petunia's clipped voice. "And your uncle has guests coming after. Make yourself scarce." Harry sighed, marking his place in the book. Business associates for dinner meant Vernon would be especially intolerant of any perceived abnormality. Better to eat quickly and disappear. Downstairs, Dudley was already at the table, his plate piled high. He'd returned from his friend's house that morning, and while still massive, his frame now carried a bit more muscle beneath the fat, thanks to his boxing training. He barely glanced at Harry, too focused on shoveling mashed potatoes into his mouth. Vernon entered from the living room, already dressed in his best suit despite the summer heat, his face flushed with anticipated importance. "The Masons will be here at 7:30, he announced to the room at large. This deal could mean the biggest order Grunnings has seen in a decade. His small eyes landed on Harry. "And you, boy, I'll stay in my room, make no noise, and pretend I don't exist," Harry recited dully, having heard the instruction countless times before. Vernon's eyes narrowed. "Don't get smart with me. This is important." "I know. The Masons. Big deal. Drills. Got it." Petunia shot Harry a warning look as she placed a significantly smaller portion of chicken on his plate compared to the others. "Vernon," she said carefully, "perhaps Harry could help me with the garden tomorrow. The hydrangeas need attention, and he has experience with such things." It was Petunia's version of a peace offering. Giving Harry outdoor tasks was her way of reducing tension in the household by separating him from Vernon. Harry knew this routine well enough. Vernon grunted noncommittally, turning to Dudley. "And how was your time at Piers, son? His father tells me you're showing real promise in the ring." Dinner continued with Vernon and Petunia fawning over Dudley's every utterance while ignoring Harry completely. Harry ate mechanically, his mind drifting back to his exercises. Something had felt different today, a strange moment when his awareness had seemed to expand beyond the confines of his own skull, like tendrils of thought reaching outward. "Utterly disgraceful," Vernon was saying, his voice cutting through Harry's thoughts. "Wandering around with their unnatural hair colors and pierced everything. No discipline. If I had my way," Harry made the mistake of rolling his eyes just as Vernon glanced in his direction. "Something to contribute, boy?" Vernon snapped. "No, Uncle Vernon." "No respect," Vernon muttered, his face darkening. "Just like your good-for-nothing father. Thought he was better than decent, hard-working people, didn't he? Until his abnormality got him killed." Harry's knuckles whitened around his fork. "Don't talk about my father." The table went silent. Even Dudley paused mid-chew, his small eyes darting between Harry and Vernon with sudden interest. "What did you say to me?" Vernon asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Harry knew he should back down. The Masons were coming, Vernon was already stressed. But the constant denigration of his parents, people who had died protecting him, people whose faces he had seen emerging from Voldemort's wand, people who had been real and brave and good, ignited something fierce inside him. "I said, don't talk about my father," Harry repeated, meeting Vernon's gaze. "Or my mother. You didn't know them. You have no right to talk about them that way." Vernon's face underwent its familiar transformation from red to purple. "No right? In my own house? When we've taken you in, clothed you, fed you, and never let me forget it," Harry interrupted. "But that doesn't give you the right to lie about my parents." Vernon slammed his fist on the table, making the dishes jump. "Your father was an unemployed wastrel who got himself and your mother blown up meddling in things that decent people know to leave alone. And you're heading the same way, mark my words." Something snapped inside Harry. The familiar anger surged, but this time, it was accompanied by something else, a strange, sharp focus, as if all his mental exercises had suddenly aligned. His vision seemed to narrow, centering on Vernon's bulging eyes, and he had the bizarre sensation of falling forward despite sitting perfectly still. Wastrel. Burden. Freak. Should have drowned him as a baby. Dangerous. Abnormal. Just like his father. Lily's mistake. My house, my rules. The thoughts hit Harry like physical blows, but they weren't his thoughts. They carried Vernon's voice, Vernon's hatred, layered with images of Harry's father that Vernon had constructed from pure spite, having never actually met James Potter. Harry gasped, breaking the strange connection. The abrupt return to himself left him dizzy and nauseated. "What are you doing?" Vernon demanded, his voice tinged with an unfamiliar note. Was it fear? "Stop that freakishness right now." Harry blinked, realizing his uncle was leaning away from him, one arm half raised as if to ward off a blow. "I didn't do anything," he said automatically. "Your eyes," Petunia whispered, her own wide with shock. I didn't do anything," Harry repeated more forcefully, though his heart was racing. Had he actually glimpsed Vernon's thoughts? Was that legilimency? "Upstairs," Vernon ordered, pointing a thick finger toward the ceiling. "Now. Before my guests arrive." Harry pushed back from the table, his appetite gone. His mind was reeling with what had just happened. If he had indeed penetrated Vernon's mind, even momentarily, it opened possibilities he'd barely considered. "Vernon," Petunia said quietly as Harry stood. "Perhaps we should, not now, Petunia," Vernon growled. "The Masons will be here any minute. We'll deal with this later." Harry didn't wait to hear more. He retreated to his room, locking the door behind him and sinking onto his bed. His hands were shaking, and a thin sheen of cold sweat had broken out across his forehead. He'd done it. Accidentally, fueled by anger and without proper control, but he'd done it. He'd performed legilimency, wandlessly, wordlessly, and apparently without triggering the trace. The Ministry's monitoring seemed blind to this form of magic. But what he'd felt in those brief moments inside Vernon's mind. The pure vitriol, the deep-seated resentment that went beyond mere annoyance at housing an unwanted nephew. Vernon truly hated him, had always hated him, had even contemplated. Harry cut the thought off, unable to process the darkest glimpses he'd caught. Instead, he reached for his book with trembling hands. If he could do it once by accident, he could learn to do it deliberately, with control. The distant sound of the doorbell announced the Mason's arrival. Harry barely registered it, already lost in the text, searching for the techniques that would help him harness what he discovered. For the next week, Harry practiced relentlessly. The accidental breakthrough had given him both confidence and direction. Rather than vague meditation, he now focused on recreating that moment of connection, the sensation of his consciousness reaching outward, seeking another mind. His initial attempts on the household's other occupants were unsuccessful. Petunia moved through the house with nervous energy, assigning him garden tasks and keeping her distance otherwise. Dudley was rarely home, spending most days with his gang, returning only for meals and sleep. Vernon was avoiding Harry entirely, leaving for work early and returning late, communicating through terse notes left on the kitchen counter. Fix the fence. Mow the lawn. Stay out of the front garden when the Prestons visit. The Mason dinner had apparently gone well. Harry had heard Vernon's booming, self-congratulatory voice through his bedroom floor late that night, but something about Harry's moment of accidental legilimency had clearly unnerved his uncle enough to break their usual patterns of conflict. It was on the 8th day that opportunity finally presented itself. Harry was weeding the back garden when he heard the distinctive rattling cough of Mrs. Figg's old car pulling into her driveway across the street. Curious, Mrs. Figg rarely drove anywhere. He peered through the hedge in time to see her struggling with several large grocery bags. "Need help, Mrs. Figg?" Harry called, wiping his hands on his jeans as he crossed the street. The elderly woman peered at him through her thick glasses. "Harry." "Yes, dear, thank you. Just these bags into the kitchen, if you wouldn't mind." As Harry helped her unload the car, the familiar smell of cabbage and cat food wafting from her house, he found himself studying her face more intently than usual. Mrs. Figg had been part of his life for as long as he could remember, the babysitter the Dursleys dumped him with whenever they wanted him out of sight. Only recently had he begun to wonder if her constant presence in his life was entirely coincidental. "That's very kind, dear," Mrs. Figg said as he placed the last bag on her kitchen counter. "Would you like some tea? I've got some fruitcake left over from last week." Harry hesitated only briefly. "Yes, thank you." As Mrs. Figg busied herself with the kettle, Harry focused his attention on her, trying to recreate the intense concentration he'd felt with Vernon. He imagined his consciousness extending outward, reaching toward the old woman's mind. For several long moments, nothing happened. Then, just as Mrs. Fig turned to ask if he wanted milk. Harry felt it, the strange falling sensation, the narrowing of his vision until all he could see was Mrs. Fig's weathered face, her eyes widening slightly as his focus intensified. Should tell Dumbledore he looks too thin again. Cats need feeding before the order meeting tonight. Poor boy has no idea how much danger. The connection broke as Mrs. Fig abruptly dropped the teacup she was holding, sending ceramic shards scattering across the linoleum. Mrs. Fig? Harry asked, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. Are you okay? She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't interpret, shock mingled with something like recognition. Perfectly fine, she said after a moment, her voice higher than usual. Clumsy old hands. Never mind the tea, dear. I just remembered I'm late for a doctor's appointment. Thank you for your help with the groceries. Harry found himself ushered firmly to the door, Mrs. Fig's hand trembling slightly against his back. Mrs. Fig, he tried again, what's the order? What meeting are you? She went very still. I don't know what you're talking about, Harry. You must have misheard me. Now, I really must go. The door closed firmly behind him, leaving Harry standing on her front step, his mind reeling with what he'd glimpsed. Mrs. Fig knew Dumbledore. She was involved in something called the Order. And most importantly, she wasn't just a batty old cat lady, she was someone placed in Privet Drive to watch over him. Which meant she was either a witch or a squib, and she had been reporting on him for years. Harry walked back to number 4 in a daze, his thoughts churning. His successful use of Legilimency had revealed more than he'd bargained for, raising questions about how many other aspects of his life were being monitored and manipulated. And if Mrs. Fig could hide such secrets, what else might he discover by looking into other minds? That night, Harry couldn't sleep. He paced his small bedroom, occasionally pausing to stare out the window at the perfectly ordinary street below, seeing it with new eyes. How many other secrets might be hidden behind the pristine facades of Privet Drive? More importantly, he had proven to himself that his Legilimency was real and controllable. With Mrs. Fig, he had maintained the connection longer, perceived actual thoughts rather than just emotional impressions. With practice, he might be able to do even more. The implications were staggering. If the Ministry couldn't detect this magic, if he could use it without fear of expulsion. A sudden commotion from downstairs interrupted his thoughts, raised voices, the heavy thud of Vernon's footsteps, Petunia's higher-pitched protests. Harry moved to his door, pressing his ear against it. Absolutely destroyed it. Do you have any idea how much that client account was worth? Vernon was bellowing. It wasn't my fault, Dad. Dudley's voice whined. Malcolm was driving, I was just in the passenger seat of a stolen car. Vernon's voice cracked with rage. The police brought my son home. My son. Do you know what this will do to my reputation? The Polkisses are already calling everyone they know. Harry's eyebrows shot up. Dudley, caught joyriding in a stolen car. This was new territory, even for his delinquent cousin. Vernon, please, Petunia pleaded. Dudders was led astray. That horrible Malcolm boy has always been a bad influence. Our Dudley would never save it, Petunia. I had to look that police officer in the eye and lie about where I thought my son was tonight. Said he was at a study group. A study group. As if anyone would believe, Harry couldn't help the small, grim smile that formed on his lips. For years, the Dursleys had ignored or excused Dudley's increasingly concerning behavior. Vernon's rage now seemed less about Dudley's actions and more about the public embarrassment they had caused. The shouting continued downstairs, punctuated by what sounded like Vernon slamming his fist against a wall and Dudley's indignant protests that he didn't know the car was stolen, a transparent lie even by Dudley's standards. Harry moved away from the door, contemplating this development. Vernon's fury would need an outlet, and historically, that outlet had often been Harry, regardless of whether Harry had any connection to the actual problem. Sure enough, heavy footsteps soon thundered up the stairs, pausing outside Harry's door. Harry tensed, instinctively reaching for his wand before remembering he couldn't use it. The door flew open with enough force to bang against the wall. Vernon filled the doorway, his face an alarming shade of purple, a vein throbbing visibly in his temple. "You," he snarled, jabbing a thick finger in Harry's direction. "What did you say to him? What freakish ideas have you been putting in his head?" Harry blinked, genuinely confused. "What are you talking about? I've barely spoken to Dudley all summer." "Don't lie to me." Vernon advanced into the room. "Dudley was a good boy before you came along with your abnormality. Corrupting our household, bringing nothing but trouble." The absurdity of the accusation might have been funny if Vernon's rage weren't so palpable, so dangerous. Harry stood his ground, acutely aware that at 15, he was still significantly smaller than his uncle. "I had nothing to do with Dudley stealing a car," Harry said evenly. "You know that. Then explain why everything started going wrong when you arrived." Vernon demanded, his voice rising again. "Perfectly normal family, we were. And then you, letters through the fireplace, giant men breaking down doors, flying cars, blowing up my sister." "I didn't blow up your sister," Harry corrected automatically. "I inflated her. And that was an accident. It was the wrong thing to say." Vernon's face contorted with fresh rage, and he lunged forward with surprising speed, grabbing Harry by the front of his t-shirt and slamming him against the wall hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. "You think this is funny, do you?" Vernon hissed, his face inches from Harry's. "Think it's amusing that my son, my real son, is in trouble because of the environment you've created in this house?" Harry struggled to breathe, his feet barely touching the floor as Vernon held him against the wall. "Let go of me," he gasped. "I've had enough," Vernon continued as if Harry hadn't spoken. "Enough of your freakishness, your disrespect, your contamination of my family. If that school of yours doesn't want you back, you're out. Understand? Out." Something dangerous flared in Harry's chest, not just fear or anger, but a cold, focused intensity. As Vernon's spittle landed on his face, as the man's fingers dug painfully into his collarbones, Harry locked eyes with him and pushed with his mind. The connection was immediate and overwhelming. Unlike the glimpses he'd caught before, this time Harry plunged deep into Vernon's consciousness, bombarded by a chaotic storm of thoughts and memories. Disgrace to the family name, should have refused to take him in. Marge was right, bad blood will out. Petunia's sister and her worthless husband, the cupboard was too good for him, should have beaten the freakishness out of him years ago, might still not be too late. Beneath the surface rage, Harry sensed deeper currents, fear of the unknown, of magic, of anything that challenged Vernon's rigid worldview. Fear that Harry represented something beyond his control, something that threatened the carefully constructed normalcy Vernon had built his identity around. And darker still, buried memories that made Harry recoil, moments when Vernon had considered far worse treatment than Harry had actually received, restrained only by Petunia's insistence and fear of retribution from those people. The rush of information was dizzying, sickening. But Harry didn't withdraw. Instead, driven by years of pent-up resentment and the immediate need to protect himself, he pushed deeper, no longer just observing but influencing. "You hurt me," Harry projected into Vernon's mind, focusing his thoughts into a concentrated stream. "Years of neglect. Years of abuse. You locked me in a cupboard. You starved me. You hit me. You knew it was wrong. You did it anyway." Vernon's grip on Harry's shirt slackened, his eyes going wide and unfocused. What are you?" "Stop, you will remember everything you've done to me," Harry continued, the strange power flowing more easily now. "Every cruel word. Every missed meal. Every time you looked the other way when Dudley hurt me. Every lie you told the neighbors about me." Vernon staggered backward, releasing Harry entirely, his hands rising to clutch at his head. Get out of my, you will tell the truth," Harry commanded, advancing as Vernon retreated. You will confess what you've done. To Petunia. To Dudley. To the police, if necessary. You will hide nothing. No, Vernon moaned, his back hitting the opposite wall. I won't, you can't make me, but Harry could feel the suggestion taking root, wrapping itself around Vernon's thoughts like a climbing vine, impossible to dislodge. The man's mental defenses were practically non-existent, he had no concept of how to resist this kind of intrusion. You will tell the truth tomorrow, Harry finished, finally withdrawing from Vernon's mind. The separation was like surfacing from deep water, leaving him gasping and lightheaded. Vernon slid down the wall to sit heavily on the floor, his face ashen, his breathing labored. He stared at Harry with an expression the boy had never seen before, pure, undiluted fear. What did you do to me? Vernon whispered. Harry stood over him, suddenly aware of their reversed positions. For the first time in his life, he held complete power over Vernon Dursley. The realization was dizzying, intoxicating, and terrifying. I showed you the truth, Harry said quietly. Your truth. Now you're going to show it to everyone else. Vernon continued to stare, his mouth working soundlessly. Then, with effort, he pushed himself to his feet and stumbled from the room without another word, leaving the door hanging open behind him. Harry sank onto his bed, his legs suddenly unable to support him. The enormity of what he'd just done crashed over him like a wave. He'd used legilimency not just to read Vernon's mind but to implant a compulsion, to fundamentally alter his uncle's thoughts and behaviors. It was magic far beyond anything he'd been taught at Hogwarts. Magic that bordered on the control the imperious curse offered, though without the total subjugation that unforgivable curse created. This was subtler, working with Vernon's existing thoughts and memories, amplifying them until they could no longer be suppressed or denied. And he had done it wandlessly, wordlessly, apparently undetected by the ministry. Outside his room, he could hear Vernon's heavy footsteps retreating to the master bedroom, followed by Petunia's concerned questioning and a door slamming shut. Whatever happened next, Harry had set something irreversible in motion. The question was, could he live with the consequences? Harry woke to screaming. Sunlight streamed through his window, indicating he'd slept later than usual. For a moment, he lay disoriented, the events of the previous night seeming like a particularly vivid dream. Then Petunia's voice cut through the morning quiet again, high and panicked. Vernon, what are you saying? Vernon, stop this at once. Reality crashed back. Harry sat up, reaching automatically for his glasses. His head throbbed dully, an after-effect of the mental exertion from the night before. More shouting drifted up from downstairs, Petunia's increasingly hysterical protests, Dudley's confused questions, and Vernon's voice, strangely flat and mechanical, reciting what sounded like a catalogue of offenses. Harry moved cautiously to his door, opening it a crack to listen. Locked him in the cupboard for days at a time, Vernon was saying, his voice oddly distant. Knew it was wrong. Did it anyway. When he started school, told everyone he was disturbed, dangerous. Made sure no one would believe him if he complained. Dad, what the hell? Dudley's voice held a note of genuine confusion and alarm. Why are you talking like this? Language, Dudley. Petunia cut in automatically, before returning to Vernon. Vernon, please, you're not well. Let me call Dar. Patterson, withheld food as punishment, Vernon continued as if neither had spoken. Assigned impossible chores. Allowed Dudley and his friends to hurt him. Encouraged it. Struck him myself on multiple occasions. Told myself it was discipline. It wasn't. It was abuse. Harry's breath caught in his throat. He had expected his compulsion to have some effect, but this mechanical recitation, this complete breakdown of Vernon's carefully maintained facade, was beyond anything he'd imagined. Slowly, he made his way down the stairs, pausing at the bottom to observe the scene in the living room. Vernon sat rigidly on the sofa, his face blank, eyes focused on nothing. Petunia hovered anxiously beside him, one hand on his forehead as if checking for fever. Dudley stood awkwardly by the fireplace, his expression oscillating between confusion and growing anger. "The boy is not disturbed," Vernon said flatly. "He is a wizard. We knew this from the beginning. Petunia knew. I knew. We lied to him. Tried to stamp the magic out of him. Knew it was wrong. Did it anyway. Vernon, stop this." Petunia pleaded, her voice breaking. "Think of what you're saying. Think of who might hear." Vernon's gaze shifted to Harry, standing at the foot of the stairs. There was recognition in his eyes, but it was distant, as if he were looking at Harry through a fog. "There he is," Vernon said, his voice still eerily emotionless. "Harry Potter. My sister's nephew. I have abused him for 14 years. Systematically. Deliberately. Must confess. Must make it right." Petunia turned, following Vernon's gaze, her face draining of color when she saw Harry. "You," she hissed. "What have you done to him?" "Nothing," Harry said, the lie coming easily. "What's going on? Don't play innocent with me." Petunia's voice rose to a shriek. This is one of your freakish tricks. You've done something to Vernon." Dudley was looking between his father and Harry, his small eyes narrowed with dawning suspicion. "Did you use, you know what, on Dad?" he asked, unconsciously backing away from Harry. "Is that even possible?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Harry maintained, though a small part of him was impressed by Dudley's perceptiveness. "I just woke up to the shouting." "He's been like this since he came to bed last night," Petunia said, her voice shaking. "Sitting up, staring at nothing, occasionally muttering to himself. And then this morning, he just started, confessing. To things that never happened." "They happened," Vernon interrupted, his gaze still fixed on Harry. "All of them. The cupboard. The starvation. The lies. Must tell the truth now. Must confess." With a sudden, jerky movement, Vernon stood, causing Petunia to stumble backward in surprise. "Must confess properly," he said, starting toward the door. "To the authorities. To the police." "The police?" Petunia shrieked, lunging to block his path. "Vernon Dursley, you will do no such thing. Think of our reputation. Think of what the neighbors would say." But Vernon moved past her with the unstoppable momentum of a sleepwalker, reaching for his car keys on the hook by the door. "Dad, stop!" Dudley shouted, finally jolted into action. He grabbed his father's arm, trying to pull him back. "You're not thinking straight." Vernon shook him off with surprising strength. "Must confess," he repeated, opening the front door. "Must make it right." Harry stood frozen, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of fascination and growing horror. He had wanted Vernon to acknowledge the truth, to feel remorse for his treatment over the years, but this robotic, compulsive behavior was unsettling even to him. He had created a kind of magical automaton, driven by a single purpose that overrode all other considerations. "Harry, stop him!" Petunia pleaded, turning to him in desperation. "Whatever you've done, undo it. He'll ruin us all." The naked panic in her voice stirred something in Harry, not sympathy exactly, but a dawning realization of the magnitude of what he'd set in motion. If Vernon went to the police, confessed to years of child abuse, it wouldn't just affect the Dursleys. It would trigger investigations, social services involvement, questions about why Harry had never reported the abuse himself, questions about where he went for most of the year. Questions that could potentially expose the wizarding world. "Uncle Vernon," Harry called, hurrying after him as Vernon strode purposefully toward the car. "Wait. You don't need to go to the police." Vernon paused, half turning. "Must confess," he said again, but there was a hint of uncertainty now. "Must tell the truth." Harry took a deep breath, reaching for the connection he'd established the night before. It was still there, a thin thread linking his mind to Vernon's, the compulsion pulsing along it like a heartbeat. "You will tell the truth," Harry had commanded. "You will confess what you've done." But he hadn't specified how or to whom, beyond a vague mention of police, if necessary. The compulsion had taken root more deeply than intended, becoming an overwhelming imperative rather than a nudge toward honesty. Harry focused, trying to modify the suggestion. "You've already confessed to your family," he projected, looking directly into Vernon's unfocused eyes. "That's enough for now. You don't need to go to the police yet." Vernon swayed slightly on his feet. "Already confessed," he repeated slowly. "To family. Enough for now." "That's right," Harry continued, both aloud and mentally. "You should rest now. Think about what you've done. The police can wait." "Rest," Vernon echoed. "Think. Police can wait." Behind them, Petunia and Dudley watched in confused silence as Vernon turned away from the car and shuffled back toward the house, his movement still oddly mechanical but his immediate drive to reach the authorities apparently dampened. As Vernon passed him, Harry felt a chill run down his spine. He had altered his uncle's behavior with nothing more than the power of his mind, controlling him almost as completely as an imperious curse, but with more subtlety. The ethical implications were staggering. "What did you do?" Dudley asked as soon as Vernon was back inside, his voice hushed with a mixture of fear and reluctant awe. "How did you make him listen to you?" "I didn't do anything," Harry insisted, though the lie was wearing thin even to his own ears. "He's obviously not well. Maybe he should see a doctor." Petunia was staring at Harry with naked hatred, all pretense of civility stripped away. "This is your doing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how, without your wand and your spells, but this is your doing." Harry met her gaze steadily, neither confirming nor denying the accusation. "He's only telling the truth, Aunt Petunia. Isn't that what you've always taught me? That lying is wrong." Petunia flinched as if he'd struck her. Without another word, she turned and hurried back into the house, presumably to attend to Vernon. Dudley lingered, studying Harry with an expression that suggested he was seeing his cousin clearly for the first time. "You're dangerous," he said finally, not as an accusation but as a simple statement of fact. "Really dangerous." Harry said nothing, but something must have shown in his face, because Dudley took an involuntary step backward. "I'm going to check on Dad," Dudley muttered, retreating toward the house. At the door, he paused. "Whatever you did, can you fix him?" The question caught Harry off guard. There was genuine concern in Dudley's voice, perhaps the first unselfish emotion Harry had ever heard from his cousin. "I don't know," Harry answered honestly. "I hope so." Dudley nodded once, then disappeared inside, leaving Harry alone in the driveway, the weight of his actions settling over him like a physical burden. He had wielded power over another person's mind, crossing a line he'd never imagined crossing, venturing into magical territory that edged dangerously close to the dark arts. And yet, hadn't Vernon deserved it? Hadn't he earned this moment of forced honesty after years of cruelty? The justifications rang hollow even as Harry formed them. This wasn't justice, it was vengeance, wrapped in a thin disguise of truth-telling. And whatever satisfaction he might have expected to feel at seeing Vernon finally acknowledge his wrongs was overshadowed by the disturbing reality of what he'd done to achieve it. As he slowly walked back to the house, Harry knew that nothing would ever be the same again, not his relationship with the Dursleys, not his understanding of his own magical abilities, and perhaps most significantly, not his sense of where the moral boundaries lay in his increasingly complicated life. He had broken Vernon Dursley's mind. Now he had to live with the consequences. Chapter 2, Consequences Unforeseen. Harry didn't sleep. How could he, when Vernon's flat, mechanical voice echoed through the walls of number 4 all night long? The compulsion Harry had planted seemed to have taken on a life of its own. Though no longer fixated on confessing to the police, Vernon now muttered his litany of sins to Petunia in their bedroom, his voice rising and falling with eerie regularity. The cupboard under the stairs, knew it was wrong, did it anyway. Sitting on his bed, back against the headboard, Harry pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. What had he done? He'd wanted justice, wanted Vernon to acknowledge years of mistreatment, but this hollow, puppet-like confession wasn't what he'd imagined. By dawn, the house had finally fallen silent. Harry moved to his window, watching as the first golden rays illuminated the identical houses of Privet Drive. The street looked the same as it always had, peaceful, ordinary, hiding its secrets behind pristine facades and carefully trimmed hedges. Just like him. Just like the magic he'd performed. A soft knock at his door startled him. Harry turned, tensing instinctively. "It's me," came Dudley's voice, uncharacteristically subdued. Harry hesitated, then crossed to the door and opened it. His cousin stood awkwardly in the hallway, his bulky frame seeming diminished somehow. There were dark circles under his small eyes, he hadn't slept either. "Dad's gone," Dudley said without preamble. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" "He left before sunrise. Took the car." Dudley's voice was flat, almost emotionless. "Mum tried to stop him. He just kept saying he had to make it right. She's downstairs now, crying." Harry felt the floor tilt beneath him. "Did he say where he was going?" "Where do you think?" Dudley's eyes hardened. "The police station. To confess. Just like he's been saying he would." A cold knot formed in Harry's stomach. He'd modified the compulsion, told Vernon the police could wait, but apparently the original suggestion had been too powerful, too deeply rooted. "Dudley, I don't," his cousin cut him off. "I know it was you. I don't know how you did it without your wand thing. But I know it was you." Dudley took a deep breath, seeming to struggle with himself. "And the worst part is, I'm not sure I can blame you." Harry stared at him, taken aback. "What?" Dudley wouldn't meet his eyes. "The things he was saying all night, about the cupboard, about starving you. I always knew, you know. I just didn't." He trailed off, fists clenching at his sides. "I didn't think about it. It was easier not to think about it." The admission hung between them, startling in its honesty. Before Harry could respond, the sound of tires on gravel drew their attention to the window. A police car had pulled into the driveway, its lights mercifully not flashing. "Too late," Dudley muttered, moving past Harry to look out the window. "They're here." Harry joined him, watching as two officers emerged from the vehicle. One was speaking into a radio clipped to his shoulder, the other approached the front door with measured steps. "He must have told them everything," Harry said quietly. Dudley nodded, his expression unreadable. "Dad never does anything halfway." After a pause, he added, "You should get dressed. This is going to be a long day." With that, Dudley turned and left, his heavy footsteps retreating down the hall. Harry quickly pulled on jeans and a t-shirt, his mind racing. He hadn't planned for this, hadn't thought beyond making Vernon acknowledge his wrongs. Now the Muggle authorities were involved, which meant questions, investigations, and inevitably, exposure. And if the ministry caught wind of what he'd done? The doorbell rang, followed by Petunia's strangled sob and the sound of the front door opening. Harry took a deep breath, steeling himself, and headed downstairs. In the entryway, Petunia stood clutching a handkerchief to her mouth, her face blotchy with tears. The female police officer was speaking to her in low, gentle tones, while her male colleague stood slightly behind, notepad in hand. "Understand this is difficult, Mrs. Dursley, but we need to ask you some questions about these allegations," the woman was saying. "Your husband came into the station this morning making some very serious claims about his treatment of your nephew." Petunia's eyes darted to Harry as he reached the bottom of the stairs, a silent plea in them that he couldn't quite interpret. Beg for forgiveness? Lie to the police? Make Vernon normal again? "Harry Potter," the male officer asked, following Petunia's gaze. Harry nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. "Yes, sir." The female officer turned to him, her expression professionally neutral but her eyes kind. "Hello, Harry. I'm Officer Bennett, and this is Officer Grimes. We'd like to have a word with you, if that's all right." "Am I in trouble?" Harry asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Officer Bennett shook her head. "No, not at all. Your uncle came to us this morning with some concerning statements about how you've been treated in this household. We're here to make sure you're safe and to understand what's been happening." "What exactly did my uncle tell you?" Harry asked, carefully watching Petunia from the corner of his eye. Her hands were trembling violently. "Perhaps we should sit down," Officer Grimes suggested, gesturing toward the living room. The next hour passed in a surreal blur. In the immaculate living room that had been the stage for so many moments of Harry's humiliation, the officers gently but persistently questioned him about his life at number 4. Had he really been made to sleep in a cupboard? Was he denied food as punishment? Had Vernon ever struck him? Harry answered truthfully but selectively, aware that the full story, complete with owls, Hogwarts letters, and Hagrid giving Dudley a pig's tail, would raise more questions than it answered. Yes, he had slept in the cupboard until he was 11. Yes, meals were sometimes withheld. Yes, Vernon had occasionally become physical, though Harry downplayed the frequency and severity. Throughout, Petunia sat rigid on the edge of the sofa, occasionally interjecting with weak justifications that sounded hollow even to her own ears. He was a difficult child. We didn't know how to handle his behavioral problems. Vernon sometimes lost his temper, but never. "Mrs. Dursley," Officer Bennett interrupted gently after one such attempt, "your husband has given us a detailed statement that contradicts much of what you're saying. He was quite specific about the nature and extent of the abuse." Petunia flinched at the word abuse, as if it were a physical blow. "Vernon is unwell," she insisted, her voice cracking. "He hasn't been himself since yesterday. He needs medical attention, not interrogation." "We have a doctor examining him now," Officer Grimes said, making another note. But his statement was remarkably coherent, if unusual in its delivery. Dudley, who had been lurking in the doorway, finally entered the room fully. "It's true," he said abruptly. "What Dad said. About the cupboard and the food and everything." Petunia gasped. "Dudley. I'm sorry, Mum." Dudley wouldn't look at her, his gaze fixed somewhere on the carpet. "But it's true. We all know it's true." A heavy silence fell over the room. Harry stared at his cousin in disbelief. Of all the unexpected consequences of his actions, Dudley Dursley developing a conscience ranked among the most improbable. Officer Bennett exchanged a glance with her colleague before turning back to Harry. "Given the circumstances, we'll need to make arrangements for temporary alternative accommodation for you, Harry. Is there someone you could stay with? Another family member, perhaps, or a friend?" Harry's mind immediately leapt to the Weasleys, but he hesitated. How could he explain them to the Muggle authorities? How could he contact them in the first place? Before he could answer, a sharp crack split the air outside, the unmistakable sound of someone apparating onto the front lawn of number 4. Everyone in the room jumped. "What was that?" Officer Grimes asked, half rising from his seat. "Car backfiring," Harry said quickly. "Happens all the time on this street." The doorbell rang, its ordinary chime somehow ominous in the tense atmosphere. Officer Grimes moved to answer it, hand instinctively moving toward his belt. "Wait," Harry said desperately, but it was too late. The officer had already pulled open the door, revealing the last person Harry expected to see standing on the Dursleys' doorstep. Arthur Weasley, dressed in what was clearly his idea of appropriate Muggle attire, a tweed suit with a violently orange tie and mismatched running shoes, beamed at the startled officer. "Good morning," Mr. Weasley said cheerfully. "Lovely day, isn't it?" I'm Arthur Weasley, here to collect Harry Potter. I understand there's been a bit of a situation. Officer Grimes stared at him, momentarily speechless. And you are, he finally managed. A family friend, Mr. Weasley replied promptly. I've been authorized to provide temporary guardianship for Harry while these unfortunate matters are sorted out. He produced an official-looking document from his breast pocket and handed it to the officer with a flourish. Harry moved to the doorway, utterly confused. How had Mr. Weasley known to come? And what kind of document could he possibly have that would satisfy the Muggle authorities? Officer Grimes examined the paper, his brow furrowed. This seems to be in order, but I'll need to verify it with my superiors. You understand, given the circumstances. Of course, of course. Mr. Weasley nodded vigorously. Due diligence and all that. I'm quite familiar with law enforcement protocols. Fascinating work you do, absolutely fascinating. Those radio devices on your shoulders, ingenious. Do they run on electricity? I'm sorry, what? Officer Grimes looked increasingly bewildered. Harry stepped forward quickly. Mr. Weasley is a bit of a technology enthusiast, he explained, shooting Mr. Weasley a warning look. Officer Bennet was just asking if I had somewhere to stay while everything gets sorted out. Mr. Weasley and his family have offered to take me in before. Officer Bennet joined them at the door, examining the document her colleague had handed her. This appears to be a temporary guardianship authorization from Family Services, she said, sounding slightly puzzled. They've processed this rather quickly. Efficient lot, aren't they? Mr. Weasley agreed cheerfully. Now, if it's all the same to you, I'd like to get Harry settled as soon as possible. This must be terribly distressing for him. The officers exchanged another glance, clearly torn between protocol and what appeared to be legitimate documentation. Finally, Officer Bennet nodded. We'll need an address and contact information where we can reach Harry, she said. And he'll likely need to provide a formal statement at some point. Of course, Mr. Weasley agreed, producing a business card that he handed over with barely concealed excitement. All my details are right there. Telephone and everything. Harry caught a glimpse of the card, which appeared to be perfectly ordinary to Muggle eyes but which he suspected was magically enchanted. Harry, why don't you go pack your things? Officer Bennet suggested. Officer Grimes and I need to finish speaking with your aunt and cousin. Harry nodded gratefully and bounded up the stairs, his mind whirling with questions. In his room, he hastily threw his belongings into his school trunk, clothes, books, the invisibility cloak, his wand, pausing only when he reached the Legilimency book that had started it all. After a moment's hesitation, he packed that too, burying it beneath his robes. When he dragged his trunk downstairs, he found Mr. Weasley engaged in animated conversation with Officer Grimes about the function of his ballpoint pen, while Officer Bennet spoke quietly to Petunia in the kitchen doorway. Dudley stood awkwardly by the stairs, shifting his weight from foot to foot. All set, Harry? Mr. Weasley asked brightly, reluctantly returning the pen to the bemused officer. Yes, sir, Harry replied, then turned to Dudley. After a moment's hesitation, he extended his hand. Bye, Dudley. His cousin stared at the offered hand in surprise before slowly reaching out to shake it. Bye, Harry. After a pause, he added in a lower voice, I'm sorry. About everything. Harry nodded, not trusting himself to speak. This strange, newfound honesty between them was too fragile, too unexpected to withstand many words. Petunia had emerged from the kitchen, her eyes red but her composure somewhat restored. She looked at Harry with an unreadable expression, not quite hatred, not quite remorse, but something complex that spoke of years of buried emotions. Aunt Petunia, Harry acknowledged with a nod. She pressed her lips together tightly, then said, Will they let Vernon come home? It wasn't what Harry had expected, no recriminations, no accusations, just this simple question laden with fear. I don't know, he answered honestly. It depends on what they determine about his state of mind, I suppose. You know what caused it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Harry held her gaze. Yes. Can you reverse it? The directness of the question caught him off guard. Harry glanced at the officers, who were now examining Mr. Weasley's documentation more closely, then back at his aunt. I don't know, he admitted. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Something flickered across Petunia's face, recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of an old memory. Lily once said the same thing, she murmured. About something she did to me when we were children. That she didn't mean for it to go so far. She shook her head slightly. Be careful, Harry. Power isn't always kind to those who wield it. Before Harry could respond to this unexpected wisdom, Mr. Weasley clapped his hands together. Right then. Time we were off. Thank you, officers, for your excellent work. Mrs. Dudley, will be in touch. Outside, Mr. Weasley led Harry to the end of Privet Drive, well out of sight of the house, before finally dropping his cheerful facade. Merlin's beard, Harry, he said, his expression grave. What happened back there? The Ministry's been in an uproar since dawn, unauthorized magic detected at your residence, Muggle authorities involved, reports of a Muggle behaving oddly. And then Dumbledore called an emergency order meeting. The order? Harry seized on the familiar term from Mrs. Figg's thoughts. You mean the order that Mrs. Figg is part of? Mr. Weasley's eyebrows shot up in surprise. How do you know about Arabella's involvement? That's supposed to be, he stopped himself, shaking his head. Never mind that now. We need to get you to safety before the Ministry officials show up. They're not far behind me. Ministry officials? But I didn't use my wand. I didn't cast any spells. Maybe not conventional ones, Mr. Weasley said, glancing around nervously. But something magical happened in that house, Harry, something powerful enough to trigger the detection charms. And given the current climate at the Ministry. He trailed off, his expression troubled. What current climate? What's going on? Mr. Weasley sighed. Not here. I'll explain everything once we're safe. Now, hold on to your trunk and take my arm. We're going to apparate. But what about the trace? Harry protested. Won't apparating trigger it too? I'm doing the magic, not you, Mr. Weasley explained. Besides, at this point, a little more detected magic won't make much difference. Now, quickly. Harry gripped his trunk handle with one hand and Mr. Weasley's arm with the other. With a last glance at Privet Drive, where Officer Bennet was now standing on the front step, watching them with a puzzled expression, Harry felt the crushing sensation of apparition whisk him away. They materialized in the middle of a sunlit field, the sudden transition from suburban Surrey to open countryside momentarily disorienting Harry. In the distance, the crooked silhouette of the burrow rose against the clear blue sky, its mismatched additions and magical modifications a welcome sight after the sterile conformity of Privet Drive. We'll walk from here, Mr. Weasley said, helping Harry steady his trunk. The wards don't allow direct apparition anymore. Not since he who must not be named returned. As they trudged through the long grass toward the Weasleys' home, Mr. Weasley filled Harry in on the events that had followed the Triwizard Tournament. The Ministry, led by Cornelius Fudge, had refused to acknowledge Voldemort's return, instead launching a subtle but persistent campaign to discredit both Harry and Dumbledore. The Daily Prophet had published a series of articles questioning Harry's mental stability, suggesting that the traumatic events of the tournament had left him confused and delusional. It's been building all summer, Mr. Weasley explained grimly. Fudge is afraid of the truth, afraid of what accepting Voldemort's return would mean for his position. And now, with this incident at your relative's home. It gives them more ammunition, Harry realized. They can say I'm not just delusional but dangerous. Precisely. Mr. Weasley's expression was grim. Which is why we need to know exactly what happened, Harry. What kind of magic did you perform on your uncle? Harry hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. The use of legilimency without consent, especially to implant thoughts or compulsions, edged dangerously close to dark magic territory. Before he could decide how to respond, they reached the Burrow's back garden, where the entire Weasley family, plus Hermione, seemed to be waiting anxiously. Mrs. Weasley rushed forward as soon as she spotted them, enveloping Harry in one of her bone-crushing hugs. "Harry, dear. Thank goodness Arthur found you in time. We've been so worried." "I'm fine, Mrs. Weasley," Harry managed, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "Really?" She held him at arm's length, examining him with a mother's critical eye. "You're too thin, as always. And you look exhausted. Come inside, I've got breakfast waiting." The kitchen was chaotic in the familiar, comforting way that characterized the Burrow. Fred and George were huddled at one end of the table, heads together over what looked suspiciously like order forms for their joke products. Ginny was setting out plates, her long red hair tied back in a practical ponytail. Ron and Hermione sat side by side, both jumping to their feet when Harry entered. "Harry!" Hermione exclaimed, hurrying over to hug him. "We've been so worried. The ministry's issued a summons for you to attend a disciplinary hearing, and the Daily Prophet's already running stories about the boy who lived attacking muggles." "Whoa, slow down," Harry interrupted, his stomach dropping. "A hearing? Already? They can't even know what happened yet." "That's fudge for you," Ron said darkly, clapping Harry on the shoulder in greeting. "Dad says he's been looking for any excuse to bring you in. This just handed it to him on a silver platter. But I didn't attack anyone. And I didn't use my wand." Hermione exchanged a worried glance with Ron. "Harry, what exactly did you do?" "All we know is that your uncle showed up at a police station confessing to abusing you, and he was behaving so oddly that the Muggle authorities called in mental health experts." Harry felt the weight of everyone's gaze upon him. Mr. Weasley had moved to stand by the fireplace, his expression grave. Mrs. Weasley had stopped fussing with the breakfast plates, her hands stilling on the table. Even Fred and George had abandoned their order forms to listen. Harry began, then faltered. How could he explain what he'd done without admitting to using what amounted to a dark mental art? "Vernon attacked me. He was blaming me for something Dudley had done, and he grabbed me. I was scared, angry, and something just happened." "Accidental magic?" Hermione suggested, though she sounded skeptical. "But you're 15, Harry. Accidental magic usually stops once you start formal training." "Not accidental, exactly," Harry admitted. I've been studying something. A form of magic that doesn't require a wand. I didn't think it would trigger the trace." "What kind of magic?" Mr. Weasley asked sharply. Harry took a deep breath. "Legilimency." The silence that followed was deafening. Hermione's eyes widened in shock, her hand flying to her mouth. Ron looked confused, clearly unfamiliar with the term. The twins exchanged significant looks, while Ginny's expression became wary. "Legilimency," Mr. Weasley repeated slowly. "Harry, that's extremely advanced magic. Where did you even learn about it?" "Books, mostly," Harry said, not meeting his eyes. "And I overheard Snape and Dumbledore talking about it once. After everything that happened at the end of last term, with Voldemort back and the visions I've been having. I thought I should learn to protect my mind." It wasn't entirely a lie. The research had started as self-protection, even if it had evolved into something else. But legilimency is the art of navigating another's mind, not protecting your own, Hermione said, her academic knowledge surfacing despite her shock. "You'd need a clemency for protection." "I know that now," Harry replied. "But the books I found talked about both, and I thought understanding one would help with the other." Mrs. Weasley had gone pale. Arthur, she said quietly, perhaps we should contact Dumbledore. Immediately. Mr. Weasley nodded. I was thinking the same thing. He turned back to Harry, his expression somber. Harry, I need you to tell me exactly what you did to your uncle. The full truth, now. This is serious. Harry swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his actions more acutely than ever. I entered his mind, he said quietly. I saw his thoughts, about me, about my parents, about everything. He was so full of hatred and fear. And then I just pushed. I told him to remember the truth about how he treated me all these years, and to confess it. I didn't mean for it to take hold so strongly. I thought he'd just acknowledge it, maybe apologize. I didn't think he'd go to the police. Oh, Harry, Hermione whispered, her eyes filling with tears. That's close to the Imperius curse. It's not. Harry protested, though a part of him had thought the same thing. I didn't control his actions, not directly. I just amplified the truth he already knew. Made it impossible for him to ignore or deny it anymore. The Ministry won't see it that way, Mr. Weasley said gravely. Especially not now, with Fudge looking for any reason to discredit you. Unauthorized use of legilimency on a muggle, resulting in behavior that risked exposure of our world. This is serious, Harry. Very serious. The hearing's scheduled for tomorrow morning, Hermione added quietly. It was in the Prophet this morning, along with other things. What other things? Harry demanded, a sick feeling growing in his stomach. Ron reached for a folded newspaper on the end of the table and handed it to Harry with evident reluctance. See for yourself. It's rubbish, of course, but... Harry unfolded the Daily Prophet, and his heart sank. Splashed across the front page was the headline, Boy Who Lived Uses Dark Magic on Muggle Guardian. Beneath it, a photo of Harry from the Triwizard Tournament showed him looking exhausted and haunted, deliberately selected, he was sure, to make him appear unstable. The article itself was worse, filled with inflammatory language and thinly veiled accusations, in a shocking development that raises further questions about the mental stability of Harry Potter. The boy who lived allegedly performed unauthorized dark magic on his Muggle uncle yesterday evening, causing the man to exhibit bizarre behavior and make outlandish claims to Muggle authorities. Sources within the Ministry confirmed that detection charms registered powerful magic at the Potter residence, despite the well-known prohibition against underage wizardry. This incident follows Potter's disturbing claims about the return of He Who Must Not Be Named, claims that Ministry officials have repeatedly debunked as the delusions of a traumatized and possibly unstable young wizard. Senior Ministry official Dolores Umbridge expressed grave concern over the incident. This behavior demonstrates exactly why the Ministry must maintain closer oversight of magical education and the integration of Muggle-raised wizards into our society. Clearly, young Mr. Potter has developed dangerous tendencies that must be addressed before further harm is done. Harry threw the paper down in disgust. They've already decided I'm guilty. And who's Dolores Umbridge? Why is she commenting on me? Senior Undersecretary to the Minister, Mr. Weasley explained with evident distaste. Fudge's right hand. She's been pushing for stricter control over Hogwarts and has made some rather unpleasant remarks about half-breeds and muggleborns in the past. She sounds lovely, Harry muttered. The important thing, Mrs. Weasley interjected, her practical nature asserting itself, is to prepare for the hearing. Arthur, you should contact Albus immediately. And Harry needs to eat something before we start figuring all this out. As if on cue, Harry's stomach growled loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since the previous evening's tense dinner. The conversation paused while Mrs. Weasley loaded his plate with eggs, bacon, and toast, and Mr. Weasley stepped outside to send a Patronus message to Dumbledore. So, Fred said into the awkward silence, leaning forward with undisguised interest, you can actually read minds now, Harry. Without a wand or anything. It's not reading minds, exactly, Harry corrected automatically. Thoughts aren't organized like books. It's more like, navigating through someone's consciousness. Seeing fragments, impressions, memories. Still bloody impressive, George commented. Any chance you could teach us? Would be dead useful for the joke shop, knowing what customers really want. George Weasley. Mrs. Weasley exclaimed, scandalized. This is not a joke. Harry is in serious trouble, and you're talking about using Legilimency for your silly products. Sorry, Mum, George replied, not looking particularly repentant. Just trying to lighten the mood. The Ministry can't actually prove I use Legilimency, can they? Harry asked, turning to Hermione, who usually had the answers to such technical questions. I mean, it doesn't leave a magical signature like spells do. Hermione bit her lip, thinking. I don't know, Harry. Legilimency is so rare and specialized. But you're right, it's not like casting a charm or hex. The magic is more internal. More subtle. They'd need a confession, probably, Ron suggested through a mouthful of toast. Or a witness. Which they don't have, Harry said, feeling a flicker of hope. Unless. He paused, a troubling thought occurring to him. Unless they use Veritaserum. Or Legilimency themselves. They wouldn't, Hermione gasped. Not on an underage wizard. That would be, completely in line with how they've been behaving lately, Mr. Weasley interrupted, returning to the kitchen with a grim expression. Dumbledore's on his way. He wants to speak with Harry privately before we discuss defense strategies for the hearing. Harry's appetite vanished. The thought of facing Dumbledore, of explaining what he'd done and why, filled him with a complex mixture of shame and defiance. The headmaster had left him at the Dursleys year after year, had sent him back even after knowing about the cupboard, the bars on the window, the cat flap through which meager meals were passed. When will he be here? Harry asked, pushing his plate away. Any moment, Mr. Weasley replied. He's coming directly from an emergency session of the Wisengamot. Apparently Fudge is trying to change the format of your hearing from a standard disciplinary proceeding to a full criminal trial. What? Hermione exclaimed. He can't do that. The educational decree clearly states that underage magic violations are to be handled administratively unless there's serious harm or death involved. Fudge seems determined to make an example of Harry, Mr. Weasley said heavily. Dumbledore is fighting it, but with the current political climate. He was interrupted by a soft pop from the garden, followed by a knock at the back door. Mrs. Weasley hurried to open it, revealing Albus Dumbledore standing on the threshold, resplendent in midnight blue robes embroidered with silver stars. Albus! Thank goodness you're here, Mrs. Weasley said, ushering him inside. Tea. Something to eat. Thank you, Molly, but I must speak with Harry immediately, Dumbledore replied, his voice grave. His eyes swept the kitchen, landing on Harry with an intensity that was difficult to meet. Perhaps we could use your sitting room for a few minutes. Harry stood, his legs feeling oddly unsteady. Yes, sir. He followed Dumbledore into the Weasleys' cozy sitting room, acutely aware of the weight of his friends' concerned gazes on his back. The headmaster closed the door behind them with a gentle flick of his wand, then cast a privacy charm that made the air shimmer briefly. Sit, please, Harry, Dumbledore said, gesturing to an armchair while taking its twin for himself. Harry obeyed, his mouth dry. For a long moment, Dumbledore simply looked at him, his blue eyes missing their usual twinkle, his expression uncharacteristically somber. I find myself in an unusual position, Harry, the headmaster finally said. Torn between concern for your future and a certain understanding of your actions. Whatever Harry had expected, it wasn't this. Sir. Legilimency is a rare gift, Dumbledore continued, steepling his fingers. Few wizards attempt it, fewer still master it without formal training. That you manage to perform it successfully, wandlessly, and with sufficient power to compel a behavioral change in your uncle. He shook his head slightly. It speaks to extraordinary magical ability. I didn't mean for it to go so far, Harry said quickly. I just wanted him to acknowledge what he'd done. To stop lying about it. The truth is a beautiful and terrible thing, Dumbledore quoted softly. And should therefore be treated with great caution. He sighed, suddenly looking every one of his many years. I bear some responsibility for this situation. I placed you with the Dursleys knowing they were less than ideal guardians. I convinced myself the blood protection outweighed other considerations. Harry felt a surge of bitter vindication. They were abusive, Professor. Not just less than ideal. They locked me in a cupboard for 10 years. They starved me. Vernon hit me. Yes, Dumbledore acknowledged, the single word heavy with regret. And while I did not know the full extent of it, I knew enough to have intervened more directly. For that failure, I apologize. The simple acknowledgement, the straightforward apology, took the wind from Harry's sails. He had expected defenses, justifications, perhaps even a lecture on his use of legilimency. Instead, Dumbledore was offering something he'd never received from an adult before, accountability. However, Dumbledore continued, his tone shifting subtly, what you did to your uncle crosses a line, Harry. To enter another's mind without consent, to implant thoughts or compulsions, however justified they might feel, it violates something sacred. The autonomy of an individual's consciousness. He violated my autonomy for years, Harry countered, the defiance returning. My body. My dignity. And two wrongs have never made a right, Dumbledore replied gently. Revenge, even when disguised as justice, tends to wound the one who seeks it as much as their target. Harry looked away, unable to maintain eye contact under the weight of the headmaster's quiet wisdom. A part of him knew Dumbledore was right, hadn't he felt that sick twist of shame even as he pushed into Vernon's mind? Hadn't the hollow, puppet-like quality of his uncle's confession left him feeling empty rather than vindicated? What happens now? He asked finally, staring at his hands. The hearing. The situation is grave, Dumbledore admitted. Minister Fudge sees this as an opportunity to discredit both you and, by extension, me. Our claims about Voldemort's return have made us inconvenient truths he wishes to silence. So I'll be expelled, Harry said flatly. Not if I have anything to say about it, Dumbledore replied, a hint of steel entering his voice. And I intend to have a great deal to say. However, we must be prepared for all outcomes. The hearing is tomorrow at 9 o'clock, in Courtroom 10. Courtroom 10. Isn't that where they tried Death Eaters? Dumbledore nodded grimly. The minister is insisting on a full criminal proceeding rather than a disciplinary hearing. It is an intimidation tactic, nothing more. But it means you will face the full Wisengamot rather than merely Mafalda Hopkirk from the improper use of magic office. Do I need a lawyer or something? Harry asked, anxiety churning in his stomach. I will act as your defense, Dumbledore assured him. Though I must ask you, Harry, to be completely honest with me now about exactly what happened. I need to know precisely what form of legilimency you performed and what compulsion you implanted in your uncle's mind. Harry hesitated only briefly before recounting the events of the previous night in detail, Vernon's attack, Harry's surge of anger, the sensation of plunging into his uncle's consciousness, and the command he'd issued for Vernon to confess his wrongs. Dumbledore listened without interruption, his expression growing graver with each word. When Harry finished, the headmaster was silent for a long moment, his eyes closed as if in deep thought or perhaps prayer. Such magic, he finally said, edges uncomfortably close to the Imperius curse in its effects, if not its method. The ministry will certainly attempt to frame it as such. But I didn't force him to do anything he didn't already know was true, Harry protested. I just made it impossible for him to keep lying about it. Intent matters in magic, Harry, but so does effect. Your uncle appears to have lost his free will, acting under a compulsion he cannot resist. However justified you may have felt, such an outcome is difficult to defend before magical law. So I am going to be expelled, Harry concluded, his heart sinking. I did not say that, Dumbledore corrected. Only that our defense must be carefully crafted. The law regarding legilimency is complex and rarely invoked. There may be avenues available to us. He rose, signaling the end of their private conversation. For now, rest. Prepare yourself for tomorrow. And Harry, he paused, looking down at the young wizard with an expression of mingled concern and compassion, regardless of the outcome, remember that your worth is not determined by the Ministry of Magic, nor by the Daily Prophet, nor even by an old man's mistakes in judgment. You are more than the sum of what has been done to you. With that enigmatic statement, Dumbledore removed the privacy charm and opened the door, where the entire Weasley family plus Hermione were trying very hard to look as if they hadn't been huddled near the entrance, attempting to overhear. Molly, Arthur, Dumbledore acknowledged with a nod. I must return to the Ministry to continue preparations. I'll collect Harry tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock for the hearing. Please ensure he has proper robes for a Wizengamot appearance. Of course, Albus, Mrs. Weasley assured him. We'll take care of everything. After Dumbledore departed, Harry was immediately surrounded by his friends, all talking at once. Hermione wanted to research legal precedents for legilimency cases, Ron was offering steadfast support and outrage at the Ministry's handling of the situation, and the twins were suggesting increasingly outlandish escape plans if the hearing went badly. Enough, all of you. Mrs. Weasley finally exclaimed. Harry needs rest, not all this chatter. And we need to find him some suitable robes for tomorrow. I'll take him up to my room, Ron volunteered. He can have Percy's old bed. As Harry followed Ron up the winding staircase of the burrow, Hermione and Ginny trailing behind, he felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief at being away from Privet Drive, anxiety about the hearing, guilt over the unintended consequences of his actions, and underlying it all, a stubborn kernel of justification. Vernon had deserved it, even if the method and outcome weren't what Harry had intended. In Ron's violently orange Chudley Cannons-themed bedroom, Hermione immediately sat cross-legged on the spare bed, her expression determined. We need to research legilimency laws, she declared. There must be precedents, exceptions, mitigating factors we can use. Where are you going to find books on magical law at this hour? Ron asked, flopping onto his own bed. It's not like we can pop over to Flourish and Blots. Your dad works at the Ministry, Hermione pointed out. He must have some legal references. And we need to understand exactly what Harry did from a technical perspective. She turned to Harry. How did you learn it? What books did you use? Harry sank onto Percy's old bed, suddenly exhausted. Mostly Muggle books on meditation and mental disciplines, he admitted. And I overheard Snape talking about it once. There isn't exactly a legilimency for beginners textbook in the Hogwarts library. But you managed it anyway, Ginny said quietly from the doorway. It wasn't a question. Harry nodded, unable to read her expression. It was an accident, the first time. With Vernon. I was angry, scared, it just happened. The first time. Hermione caught the implication immediately. Harry, who else did you use it on? Just Mrs. Figg, Harry admitted reluctantly. And only briefly. I just wanted to see if I could do it again, more controlled. That's when I found out she's been reporting on me to Dumbledore all these years. She knows about something called the Order. Ron and Hermione exchanged quick glances, confirming Harry's suspicion that they knew more than they were saying. The Order of the Phoenix, Hermione said finally. It's Dumbledore's secret organization fighting against Voldemort. It existed during the First War too. And you knew about this? Harry demanded, irritation flaring. You've been keeping more secrets from me. We only found out a few weeks ago, Ron said quickly. And we're not actually in the Order, Mom says we're too young. We just overheard things when they had meetings here. Here. At the Burrow? No, at headquarters, Ginny explained. We've been staying somewhere else this summer, somewhere safe. We only came back to the Burrow this morning when we heard about what happened with your uncle. And where is this headquarters? Harry asked, trying to keep his rising frustration in check. More secrets, more information withheld from him while everyone else seemed to be in the loop. We can't tell you, Hermione said apologetically. There's a deadliest charm. Dumbledore's the secret keeper. Great, Harry muttered. More things I'm not allowed to know. It's not like that, mate, Ron protested. We wanted to tell you everything, but Dumbledore made us promise not to put anything in writing. Said owls could be intercepted. He's right, Ginny added. Dad says the ministry's been monitoring mail. Which doesn't explain why nobody could just come and tell me in person, Harry pointed out. Or why Mrs. Figg never mentioned she was keeping tabs on me for Dumbledore. Or why I had to stay at Privet Drive at all when Voldemort already has my blood for his new body, so the protection is probably compromised anyway. He was shouting by the end, years of frustration and recent trauma boiling over. The lights in the room flickered, and a glass of water on Ron's bedside table shattered, making them all jump. Harry, Hermione said gently after a moment of startled silence. We're on your side. All of us. We hate that you had to go back there, hate that you weren't told things you deserved to know. We'll help you with the hearing, Ron added firmly. And whatever happens after. And maybe, Ginny suggested, her brown eyes meeting Harry's directly, instead of dwelling on who kept what secrets, we should focus on how to keep you from being expelled tomorrow. The practical wisdom in her words deflated Harry's anger. He nodded, running a hand through his perpetually messy hair. You're right. Sorry for shouting. You're entitled to a bit of shouting, I think, Ginny replied with a small smile. Hermione was already back to planning mode. We need to understand the exact nature of the magical law involved. Legilimency itself isn't illegal, Dumbledore wouldn't use it as a defense if it were. So it must be the application that's problematic. Using it on a muggle, probably, Ron suggested. Or the compulsion part. Both, I'd guess, Harry sighed. Plus the fact that I'm underage and did it outside of school. The underage part might actually work in your favor, Hermione mused. Juvenile magical offenses are typically treated more leniently. And there's precedent for accidental magic even in older students under extreme stress. This wasn't exactly accidental, Harry pointed out. I'd been studying it for weeks. But the first successful attempt could be argued as accidental, Hermione countered. You didn't deliberately set out to cast a specific spell, your intent was defensive, triggered by your uncle's attack. That's actually not a bad angle, Harry admitted, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time since seeing the Daily Prophet headline. We should write this down, Ginny suggested, moving to Ron's desk and rummaging for parchment. Make a list of possible defenses. For the next hour, the four of them brainstormed arguments for Harry's defense, from the technical, the trace only detects wand magic, not wandless mental magic, to the emotional, Harry's history of abuse at the Dursleys' hands. Hermione eventually went downstairs to ask Mr. Weasley about ministry legal texts, returning with 2 dusty tomes that she immediately began searching for relevant precedents. As evening approached, Mrs. Weasley called them down for dinner, which proved to be a subdued affair despite the typically delicious food. Mr. Weasley had returned from the ministry with worrying news. Fudge had succeeded in changing the format of Harry's hearing to a full criminal proceeding, and rumors were circulating that Dolores Umbridge herself would be participating in the prosecution. She's never shown an interest in juvenile cases before, Mr. Weasley said, pushing his food around his plate with uncharacteristic lack of appetite. It's a concerning development. Who is this Umbridge person, exactly? Harry asked. Senior Undersecretary to the Minister, Mr. Weasley replied. But her influence extends far beyond her title. She's been behind some of the more restrictive magical creature legislation in recent years. Has a particular dislike for half-breeds, as she calls them. She sounds charming, Fred commented dryly. She's dangerous, Mr. Weasley corrected. And she's set her sights on you, Harry. Dumbledore thinks she may have the minister's ear regarding Hogwarts as well. What does that mean? Harry asked. It means, Mrs. Weasley interjected firmly, that you need to focus on the hearing tomorrow and not worry about ministry politics tonight. Now, I've laid out Percy's old dress robes for you. They're a bit long, but I can adjust them in the morning. After dinner, everyone retreated to their respective rooms with an air of tense anticipation. In Ron's bedroom, Harry found himself unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling while Ron's familiar snores filled the air. His mind kept replaying the moment he'd pushed into Vernon's consciousness, the intoxicating power he'd felt, followed by the sickening realization of what he'd done. Had he become what he hated? Used power over someone weaker, just as Vernon had done to him for years? No, he told himself firmly. Vernon had chosen cruelty. Harry had only forced him to face the truth of his actions. There was a difference, there had to be. But as sleep finally claimed him in the early hours, Harry's dreams were troubled. He found himself walking down a long, dark corridor toward a door he desperately needed to open. And beyond that door, he sensed a presence, cold, calculating, and unmistakably pleased by recent developments. Harry woke with a gasp, his scar burning. Dawn light filtered through Ron's window, illuminating the garish Chudley Cannon's posters with a golden glow. For a moment, Harry lay disoriented, the lingering echoes of his dream, Voldemort's satisfaction, the mysterious door, fading like morning mist. "You all right, mate?" Ron's voice came from the next bed, thick with sleep but concerned. "Yeah," Harry replied automatically. "Just a dream." Ron propped himself up on one elbow, suddenly more alert. "About you-know-who?" Harry nodded, pressing his palm against his scar. "He's happy about something. Really happy. I think he knows about what happened with Vernon." "How could he know that already?" "Dunno. Death Eaters in the Ministry, maybe." Harry sat up, reaching for his glasses. "What time is it?" "Just after 6, Ron yawned. "Plenty of time before Dumbledore comes for you." But Harry was already getting up, suddenly restless. "I'm going to shower. Your mum said something about adjusting those robes." An hour later, Harry stood awkwardly in the Weasleys' kitchen as Mrs. Weasley fussed over Percy's old dress robes, which she had managed to shorten to an appropriate length. The dark blue material was slightly faded but still presentable, and Mrs. Weasley had performed a complex charm to make them fit Harry's slighter frame. "There," she said finally, stepping back to examine her work. "Not perfect, but they'll do. Ministry officials always notice presentation, Arthur says." "Thank you, Mrs. Weasley," Harry said sincerely. "For everything." Her eyes softened. "Oh, Harry dear. We'll get through this. Albus won't let them expel you." "But what if they do?" "What if, then we'll deal with it," she said firmly. "One step at a time. Now, eat something. Can't face the Wizengamot on an empty stomach." Harry managed a few bites of toast and eggs, though his appetite had vanished entirely. By the time Dumbledore arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, he was pacing the kitchen nervously, his stomach in knots. "Good morning, Harry," the headmaster greeted him, resplendent in formal plum-colored robes that Harry recognized as the official Wizengamot attire. "Are you ready?" "As I'll ever be," Harry replied, straightening his borrowed robes. Dumbledore surveyed him with a critical eye. "You'll do. Now, we'll be using a portkey directly to the Ministry. I've received special authorization, given the circumstances." He produced a small silver object that Harry recognized as a deluminator. "This will take us directly to the atrium. From there, we'll proceed to level 10 for the hearing. Remember, Harry, speak only when spoken to, address the court as Madam Minister or members of the Wizengamot, and allow me to handle the legal arguments." "Yes, sir," Harry agreed, his mouth dry. Goodbyes to the Weasleys were brief but emotional. Mrs. Weasley hugged him tightly, whispering encouragement. Mr. Weasley clasped his shoulder with uncharacteristic solemnity. Ron, Hermione, and Ginny all offered words of support, while the twins attempted to lighten the mood with exaggerated salutes. "Whatever happens," Hermione said as Harry prepared to take the port key, "we're with you." Harry nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He reached out to touch the deluminator that Dumbledore held extended between them. "On 3, the headmaster said calmly. 1, 2, 3, the familiar but unpleasant sensation of being hooked behind the navel seized Harry, and the Weasley's kitchen spun away. Moments later, he landed unsteadily in the vast atrium of the Ministry of Magic, its polished dark wood floors and peacock blue ceiling momentarily disorienting him. "This way," Dumbledore said quietly, guiding Harry toward the security desk where a bored-looking wizard in peacock blue robes sat reading the Daily Prophet. Harry caught a glimpse of his own face on the front page beneath a new headline, "Potter hearing today, justice for attacked muggle?" The security wizard barely looked up as they approached. "Wands, please." Dumbledore handed over his wand first, waiting patiently as the wizard placed it on a strange brass instrument that vibrated briefly before producing a small slip of parchment. "Albus Dumbledore, Elder Wood, Phoenix Feather Core, in use for, blimey, a long time," the wizard read, handing the wand back with slightly more respect. "And you, son?" Harry reluctantly surrendered his wand, watching nervously as it underwent the same procedure. "Harry Potter, Holly and Phoenix Feather, in use for 4 years, the wizard read aloud, then did a double-take as he registered the name. "Hang on, yes, he is," Dumbledore interrupted smoothly. "And we are expected in courtroom 10 in 15 minutes. Thank you for your efficiency." He reclaimed Harry's wand, handed it back to him, and steered him toward the golden gates at the end of the atrium. As they waited for a lift, Harry became acutely aware of the stares and whispers following them. Ministry employees on their way to work slowed their pace, openly gawking at the famous pair. "Ignore them," Dumbledore advised quietly. "Focus on what lies ahead." The lift arrived with a clatter, mercifully empty. Dumbledore pressed the button for level 9, and they descended in silence. Harry's heart hammered in his chest, his palms sweating so badly he had to wipe them surreptitiously on his robes. "Department of Mysteries," announced a cool female voice as the lift stopped. "We walk from here," Dumbledore explained, leading Harry out into a corridor with bare walls. "Courtroom 10 is down the stairs." As they turned a corner, Harry stumbled to a halt, a jolt of recognition shooting through him. "This corridor, I've seen it before. In my dreams." Dumbledore paused, giving Harry a sharp look. "Dreams, Harry?" "I've been dreaming about a door," Harry explained quickly. "At the end of a dark corridor. I think it's that one." He pointed to a plain black door at the far end of the hallway. A troubled expression crossed Dumbledore's face. "The Department of Mysteries," he murmured. "We must discuss this later, Harry. For now, our concern is your hearing." He led Harry to a flight of steps descending to the right, away from the mysterious door. The staircase ended in another corridor, this one lined with heavy wooden doors. Dumbledore stopped before the last one, ornately carved and fitted with an iron lock. "Remember what I told you," the headmaster said, his blue eyes meeting Harry's with unexpected intensity. "Speak only when addressed directly. The truth, always, but do not volunteer information beyond what is asked." "And Harry," he paused, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder, "regardless of the outcome, you are not defined by their judgment." Before Harry could respond, Dumbledore pushed open the heavy door, revealing a sight that made his blood run cold. Courtroom 10 was a vast, dimly lit chamber with stone walls and tiered seating rising on all sides like an amphitheater. In the center stood a single chair, its arms wrapped with chains that moved slightly of their own accord. And facing it, on the highest tier of seats, sat at least 50 wizards and witches in plum-colored robes, all staring down at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. In the very center of the front row sat Cornelius Fudge, the Minister of Magic, his lime green bowler hat resting on the bench beside him. To his right was a square-jawed witch with short grey hair, whom Harry didn't recognize. And to Fudge's left sat a figure that could only be Dolores Umbridge, a squat woman with a wide, flabby face and bulging eyes that reminded Harry uncomfortably of a toad. She wore a black velvet bow in her short, curly hair that looked bizarrely girlish against her middle-aged features. "You're late," Fudge called out as they entered, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "I apologize, Minister," Dumbledore replied serenely. "However, by my timepiece, we are still 3 minutes early for the 9 o'clock appointment." "Yes, well," Fudge blustered, glancing at a watch. "The court is assembled. Let us begin." Percy Weasley, whom Harry hadn't noticed before, sat a little apart from the minister, a quill poised over a stack of parchment. He didn't look at Harry or Dumbledore, his expression studiedly neutral. "Disciplinary hearing of the 12th of August, Fudge began in a ringing voice, as Percy's quill raced across the parchment, into offences committed by Harry James Potter, resident at No. 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Interrogators: Cornelius Oswald Fudge, Minister for Magic; Amelia Susan Bones, Head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement; Dolores Jane Umbridge, Senior Undersecretary to the Minister. Court Scribe: Percy Ignatius Weasley, Witness for the defense." Dumbledore interrupted, his voice calm but carrying throughout the chamber, "Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore." A murmur ran through the assembled Wizengamot. Fudge looked momentarily flustered, his eyes narrowing with obvious displeasure. Yes, he said dismissively. "Dumbledore. The charges, then." He ruffled through some notes before finding the appropriate parchment. "The charges against the accused are as follows: that he knowingly and deliberately performed advanced mind magic, specifically legilimency with coercive intent, upon a muggle, one Vernon Dursley, in direct contravention of the decree for the reasonable restriction of underage sorcery, the International Statute of Secrecy, and Section 3 of the Ethical Treatment of Muggles Act." He lowered the parchment, staring at Harry over the top of his glasses. "You are Harry James Potter of No. 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey." "Yes," Harry replied, his voice sounding strangled to his own ears. "And you performed legilimency upon your muggle uncle on the evening of August 10th, causing him to exhibit bizarre behavior and make potentially expose-worthy confessions to muggle authorities." The defendant will answer the question as stated," Umbridge interrupted in a high, girlish voice that made Harry's skin crawl. "Did you or did you not perform legilimency on Vernon Dursley?" Harry glanced at Dumbledore, who gave him a tiny nod. "Yes," Harry admitted. "But, a simple, yes, is sufficient," Umbridge simpered. "The circumstances will be addressed in due course." "I believe," Dumbledore interjected smoothly, "that even in a full Wizengamot proceeding, the accused has the right to provide context for their actions, Madam Undersecretary." "Indeed they do," agreed Madam Bones, speaking for the first time. "The boy should be allowed to explain himself." Fudge looked disgruntled but nodded reluctantly. "Very well. Potter, you may provide a brief explanation for your actions." Harry took a deep breath, focusing on keeping his voice steady. "My uncle attacked me. He grabbed me, hit me, slammed me against a wall. I was scared and angry. I'd been studying mental techniques for self-protection, because of the nightmares I've been having, and something just happened. I didn't plan it. I didn't even know for sure I could do legilimency until that moment. And yet," Umbridge said sweetly, "by your own admission, you had been studying mental techniques. That suggests premeditation, does it not?" "I was studying because of my connection to Voldemort," Harry replied, ignoring the collective gasp at the name. "After what happened in the graveyard, we are not here to listen to these delusions about the Dark Lord's return," Fudge interrupted sharply. "Stick to the matter at hand, Potter." "The matter at hand," Dumbledore said firmly, "includes Harry's motivations for studying legilimency in the first place. His concerns about a mental connection to Voldemort, whether you accept the reality of that connection or not, directly informed his actions." "Fine," Fudge snapped. "But I warn you, Dumbledore, the court will not entertain elaborate tales of Dark Lord resurrections as an excuse for breaking magical law. Noted, Dumbledore replied mildly. Harry, please continue. What exactly occurred when your uncle attacked you? Harry described the confrontation with Vernon, trying to keep his account factual and unemotional despite the personal nature of the events. He explained how Vernon's rage had triggered something within him, how he'd suddenly found himself inside his uncle's mind, and how he'd commanded Vernon to acknowledge the truth about his treatment of Harry over the years. And did you intend for your uncle to confess these matters to Muggle authorities? Madam Bones asked when he finished. No, Harry said honestly. I just wanted him to stop lying about it. To admit what he'd done, at least to me and his family. I mentioned the police, but more as a possibility, not a direct command. I didn't think he'd actually go to them. Yet he did, Fudge pointed out. Resulting in Muggle law enforcement involvement, social services inquiries, and a significant risk of exposure for our world. All because you decided to play with advanced mind magic you had no business attempting. I think, Dumbledore said before Harry could respond, that we must consider the extenuating circumstances here. Harry is a minor who had just been physically assaulted. His use of wandless, unintentional magic in self-defense falls squarely within the exceptions outlined in paragraph C of the Decree for the Reasonable Restriction of Underage Sorcery. Unintentional. Umbridge repeated with a small, disbelieving laugh. By his own admission, he had been studying the technique for weeks. And he gave specific commands to his uncle's mind. That hardly qualifies as unintentional. The initial penetration of Vernon Dursley's mind was indeed unintentional, Dumbledore countered. A classic case of accidental magic triggered by emotional duress. What followed may have involved more deliberate elements, but the magical event itself was not planned or executed with malicious intent. Intent is irrelevant, Fudge dismissed. The law is clear, underage wizards may not perform magic outside of school except in life-threatening circumstances. A family argument hardly qualifies. A family argument? Harry repeated incredulously, unable to remain silent. He was choking me. He'd been abusing me for years. A murmur ran through the Wizengamot at this outburst. Madam Bones leaned forward, her monocle glinting in the torchlight. These allegations of abuse, she said slowly. They are substantiated by your uncle's statements to Muggle authorities? Yes, Harry confirmed. He confessed everything. Because it was true. Regardless of the Muggle's treatment of the boy, Umbridge interrupted, the fact remains that Potter used a form of magic that borders on an unforgivable curse. The compulsion he planted in his uncle's mind bears striking similarities to the Imperious Curse in its effects, forcing behavior the subject would not normally engage in. That is a significant overstatement, Madam Undersecretary, Dumbledore objected. Legilimency with suggestion is fundamentally different from the Imperious Curse. It does not override the subject's will entirely, merely amplifies certain thoughts or inclinations already present. In this case, the knowledge of wrongdoing that Vernon Dursley already possessed. A semantic distinction at best, Fudge scoffed. A crucial magical and legal distinction, Dumbledore corrected firmly. One that has been recognized in multiple precedents, including Wilberforce vs. the Ministry in 1837 and the more recent case of Estonia's Magical Educational Authority vs. Crum in 1979. Madam Bones nodded slowly. The precedents do support Professor Dumbledore's argument. Legilimency with suggestion has never been classified as equivalent to the Imperious Curse, particularly when performed without a wand and by an underage wizard with no formal training in the art. Fudge looked increasingly frustrated. The boy broke the law. He performed advanced magic outside of school, on a Muggle no less, resulting in a serious risk of exposure. All true points, Dumbledore acknowledged. However, the typical punishment for a first offense of underage magic is a warning letter. Harry has already received such a warning, in his second year, though it was later determined that the magic in question had actually been performed by a house elf. "This is hardly a typical case of underage magic," Umbridge objected in her sickly sweet voice. "Levitating a pudding is quite different from invading someone's mind and implanting commands." "Indeed," Dumbledore agreed. "But there are gradations of response available to the Ministry. Complete expulsion and wand snapping seems disproportionate for a first substantiated offense, particularly given the circumstances of self-defense and prior abuse." The debate continued for another hour, with Fudge and Umbridge pushing for the harshest possible penalties while Dumbledore calmly cited precedent after precedent supporting leniency. Madame Bones asked several penetrating questions about the exact nature of Harry's legilimency, seeming genuinely interested in the technical aspects of what he'd accomplished. Throughout, Harry sat in a chained chair, though thankfully, the chains had not activated to bind him, alternating between hope and despair as the legal arguments flowed back and forth over his head. The Wizengamot members occasionally whispered among themselves, their expressions impossible to read from Harry's position. Finally, Madame Bones called for a vote. "Those in favor of conviction on all charges," she asked. Hands rose throughout the chamber, Fudge's and Umbridge's immediately, followed by perhaps 20 others. Harry's heart sank. "Those in favor of clearing the accused of all charges." More hands rose, Madame Bones's among them. Harry counted frantically, but from his angle, it was impossible to get an accurate tally. "And those in favor of a modified finding?" Madame Bones continued. "Guilty of the technical violation but with significantly reduced penalties given the extenuating circumstances." The remaining hands rose, at least 15 or 20. Madame Bones conferred briefly with Fudge, whose face grew increasingly sour, before turning back to address the court. "The Wizengamot finds that Harry James Potter did indeed violate the decree for the reasonable restriction of underage sorcery and potentially endangered the international statute of secrecy," she announced. "However, given the circumstances of self-defense, the prior documented abuse by the Muggle in question, and the unintentional nature of the initial magic, the court imposes the following modified penalties. First, a formal warning regarding the use of mind magic, with mandatory instruction in proper occlumency and legilimency ethics upon return to Hogwarts. Second, probationary status for the remainder of the summer holiday, during which any further magical violations will result in immediate expulsion. Third, community service in the form of 50 hours assisting the Muggle-worthy excuse committee in developing responses to magical incidents. The defendant will retain his wand and his place at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, conditional upon adherence to these terms. This hearing is adjourned." She struck a small gavel once, the sound echoing through the chamber. For a moment, Harry sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Then Dumbledore's hand was on his shoulder, helping him to his feet. "We have been granted a partial victory," the headmaster murmured. "Best not to linger." As they made their way toward the exit, Harry caught sight of Fudge and Umbridge huddled together, both wearing expressions of thwarted malice. The toad-like woman's gaze met Harry's briefly, her bulging eyes filled with such undisguised dislike that he nearly stumbled. "Steady," Dumbledore warned quietly. "Do not give them cause for further complaint." In the corridor outside, Harry finally found his voice. "So I'm not expelled?" "No, Harry, you are not expelled," Dumbledore confirmed with a small smile. "Though you will need to be more careful than ever for the remainder of the summer. And I will arrange for those occlumency and legilimency ethics lessons when term begins." "With you?" Harry asked hopefully. A strange expression crossed Dumbledore's face, almost like regret, or perhaps apprehension. "I fear my schedule may not permit it. But we will find a suitable instructor." Harry wanted to ask more questions, about the lessons, about the mysterious door in his dreams, about why Dumbledore had barely looked at him directly throughout the entire hearing, but they were interrupted by the arrival of Arthur Weasley, hurrying down the corridor toward them with a look of anxious expectation. "Arthur," Dumbledore greeted him. "You'll be pleased to know that Harry has been cleared of the more serious charges, though there are some conditions attached to his return to Hogwarts." "Thank goodness," Mr. Weasley breathed, genuine relief flooding his features. "Molly's been beside herself with worry." We all have. I'm fine, Harry assured him. Just, probation and some community service, basically. Which I'm sure you'll complete admirably, Dumbledore said. Now, I must return to the Wizengamot, there are other matters requiring my attention. Arthur, would you be so kind as to escort Harry back to your home? Of course, Mr. Weasley agreed readily. And Harry, Dumbledore added, finally meeting his eyes directly for the first time since the hearing began, remember what I said about power and responsibility. The abilities you possess come with obligations, to yourself and to others. I trust you will reflect on that in the weeks ahead. With that enigmatic statement, Dumbledore turned and strode back toward the courtroom, his plum robe swishing behind him. Well, Mr. Weasley said brightly, clearly trying to dispel the suddenly somber mood, shall we head back? Everyone will be eager to hear the good news. As they made their way toward the lift, Harry felt a strange mixture of emotions, relief at avoiding expulsion, lingering anxiety about the probation, and an uncomfortable awareness that he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He had wielded power over another person's mind, and regardless of the justification, that act had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. And somewhere, according to his dream, Voldemort was pleased by these developments. That, perhaps, was the most unsettling realization of all. Chapter 3, The Mines Courtroom. Harry emerged from the fireplace into the Weasleys' kitchen in a cloud of green flames, stumbling slightly as his feet hit solid ground. He had never quite mastered the art of flow travel. Before he could properly regain his balance, Mrs. Weasley descended upon him, enveloping him in a bone-crushing hug that knocked his glasses askew. Oh, Harry! Arthur sent his Patronus ahead with the news. Thank goodness you're not expelled. We've been so worried. She held him at arm's length, examining him as if expecting the ministry to have somehow marked him. Are you all right, dear? Was it terribly difficult? I'm fine, Mrs. Weasley, Harry assured her, adjusting his glasses. Just glad it's over. The kitchen erupted as Ron, Hermione, Ginny, and the twins appeared, all talking at once. Hermione hugged him almost as fiercely as Mrs. Weasley had, while Ron clapped him on the back, grinning with relief. Knew Dumbledore wouldn't let them expel you, Ron declared, though his pale face and the dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't been nearly so confident. What happened exactly? Hermione demanded. Mr. Weasley's message just said you weren't expelled but had some conditions. Harry sank into a chair at the kitchen table, suddenly exhausted now that the adrenaline was wearing off. As Mrs. Weasley busied herself making tea, he recounted the hearing, the intimidating setup in courtroom 10, Fudge's obvious hostility, Umbridge's saccharine venom, and Dumbledore's methodical defense. Probation and community service, Fred mused when Harry finished. Could have been worse. Much worse, George agreed. Especially with Fudge gunning for you. It was Madame Bones who really made the difference, Harry said. She seemed actually interested in the facts, not just in making an example of me. She has a reputation for fairness, Mr. Weasley commented, having arrived shortly after Harry. One of the few senior ministry officials who isn't completely under Fudge's thumb these days. But mandatory Legilimency ethics lessons? Hermione's brow furrowed with concern. Who's going to teach those? It's such a specialized field. Harry shrugged. Dumbledore said he'd arrange it, though he can't teach me himself. Probably Snape, Ron groaned. Just what you need, more time with that greasy git poking around in your head. The conversation continued as they all relocated to the living room, the initial celebration gradually giving way to more sober discussion of what the hearing's outcome meant for Harry's future. While officially vindicated enough to keep his place at Hogwarts, he remained on thin ice with the ministry, a fact that Hermione was particularly concerned about. Probation means they'll be watching you closely, she warned. Any magical misstep, and they could revoke the ruling. I know, Harry sighed. Trust me, I'm not planning any more wandless mind magic. A troubled silence followed this statement, as it brought them back to the uncomfortable reality of what Harry had actually done, invaded someone's mind and implanted a compulsion strong enough to override their normal behavior. Even among friends who supported him unquestioningly, there was a certain unease about the nature of the magic he performed. It was Ginny who finally broke the silence, her voice unusually firm. "What about Vernon? What's happening with him now? Is he still under the influence?" Harry shifted uncomfortably. It was a question he'd been avoiding since arriving at the Burrow. "I don't know. The last I saw, the police were at the house, and he was at the station giving his statement. The ministry hearing didn't really address what happens to him." "Actually," Mr. Weasley interjected, his expression serious, "that's something we need to discuss. The Muggle authorities are proceeding with their investigation into your uncle's claims of abuse. There's going to be a hearing in their system as well, possibly as soon as next week." Harry stared at him. "What? But, I won't have to go, will I? I'm here now, safe with you." "I'm afraid you will need to participate, Harry," Mr. Weasley said gently. "The Muggle Protection Services have made it clear they consider your testimony essential. And given the unusual circumstances of your uncle's confession, the ministry feels it would raise more questions if you suddenly disappeared from the process. So I have to go back. Talk to Muggle police and judges about the Dursleys." The prospect made Harry's stomach knot with anxiety. How could he possibly explain his situation without revealing the wizarding world? How much of Vernon's behavior was still being influenced by the Legilimency? "Not immediately," Mr. Weasley assured him. "The preliminary hearing is scheduled for Monday. That gives us a few days to prepare. Dumbledore is working with the Ministry's Muggle Liaison Office to ensure everything proceeds as smoothly as possible." "Meaning they'll be modifying memories left and right," Fred muttered. "They can't obliviate an entire courtroom," Hermione pointed out. "Or all the police and social workers involved. The exposure risk is too high." "Which is precisely why Harry needs to participate," Mr. Weasley explained. "A controlled involvement is less risky than trying to make the whole situation disappear. The Muggle-Worthy Excuse Committee is developing a cover story that explains Vernon's behavior without revealing magic." "What kind of cover story could possibly explain a man suddenly confessing to years of abuse in a mechanical voice?" Harry demanded. "Mental breakdown due to stress," Mr. Weasley replied promptly. "Apparently quite believable to Muggles. They're attributing his behavior to something called a psychotic break, triggered by work pressure and family issues." Harry ran a hand through his hair, trying to process this new complication. Just when he thought he was free of the Dursleys, he was being pulled back into their orbit, forced to revisit years of mistreatment in a public forum. The thought made him physically ill. "I don't want to do this," he said quietly. "Haven't I been through enough?" A gentle hand touched his shoulder. Surprisingly, it was Ginny. "You don't have to face it alone," she said, her brown eyes meeting his with unusual intensity. "We'll help you prepare. And maybe some good can come of it. Maybe Vernon will finally face consequences for how he treated you." Harry wasn't sure why her words affected him so strongly, but the knot in his stomach loosened slightly. "I suppose you're right," he conceded. "I just wish that none of this had happened." Hermione supplied softly. "No," Harry corrected after a moment's reflection. "I was going to say I wish I had more control over the magic. That Vernon was answering for what he did because he chose to, not because I forced him." The admission hung in the air, heavy with implication. It was the first time Harry had expressed any real regret for the use of his power rather than just its consequences. Mrs. Weasley, ever practical, clapped her hands. "Well, there's no use dwelling on what's done. Harry needs rest after that hearing, and then we can discuss how to approach this Muggle court business. I'm sure Dumbledore will have advice." "Actually," Mr. Weasley said, "Dumbledore suggested that Harry speak with someone who has experience in both magical and Muggle legal systems. He's arranged for Andromeda Tonks to visit tomorrow. She worked as a legal consultant for the Ministry's Muggle Relations Department for many years." "Tonks?" Harry perked up at the familiar name. Related to her mother, Mr. Weasley confirmed with a smile. Quite different in temperament, I assure you, but equally talented in her own way. The conversation gradually shifted to less fraught topics as the day wore on. The twins retreated to their room to work on Weasley's Wizard Wheezes products, while Mrs. Weasley enlisted Ron and Ginny to help prepare dinner. Harry found himself in the garden with Hermione, who seemed determined to help him prepare for the upcoming Muggle hearing. The process will be different from a wizarding trial, she explained as they sat beneath an apple tree. Less formal in some ways, more procedural in others. And you'll need to be incredibly careful about what you say. One mention of magic. I know, Hermione, Harry sighed. Trust me, I've had plenty of practice hiding the wizarding world from muggles. I grew up with the Dursleys, remember? That's different, she insisted. This will be trained investigators, people whose job it is to notice inconsistencies, to question strange explanations. And they'll be specifically focused on your relationship with the Dursleys, which is completely entangled with magic. Harry plucked a blade of grass, twirling it between his fingers. What if I just tell them Vernon's crazy? That he made it all up? Hermione gave him a look of mingled exasperation and sympathy. Harry, you can't just dismiss years of documented abuse. The police have Vernon's testimony, and according to Mr. Weasley, they've already interviewed neighbors and school officials who corroborated parts of it. Your primary school teachers apparently had concerns about your home situation for years. They did? Harry looked up, genuinely surprised. No one ever said anything to me. They probably reported it, but nothing came of it, Hermione said sadly. It happens too often in the Muggle system. But now that Vernon has confessed, they can't ignore it. Harry leaned back against the tree trunk, closing his eyes. This is such a mess. All I wanted was for him to admit what he'd done, to stop pretending I was the problem. I never meant for it to become this. I know, Hermione said softly. But maybe Ginny's right. Maybe some good will come from it. The truth about how they treated you needed to come out eventually, Harry. He didn't respond immediately, letting the gentle summer breeze wash over him. In the distance, garden gnomes chittered as they raided Mrs. Weasley's vegetable patch, and the smell of cooking wafted from the kitchen. It was all so normal, so far removed from courtrooms and testimony and mind magic. I keep thinking about his face, Harry said suddenly. Vernon's, when I was in his mind. There was so much fear there, Hermione. Not just anger. Real fear. Of me. Of what I am. Fear often drives cruelty, Hermione observed. It doesn't excuse it, but it explains some of it. And what does that say about me? Harry opened his eyes, turning to look at her directly. I was afraid of him my whole life. And the first chance I got to have power over him, I took it. What does that make me? Hermione considered him thoughtfully. Human, she said finally. It makes you human, Harry. You made a mistake, acted out of pain and fear. The difference is, you're questioning it now. Wondering if it was right. That's what separates you from people like Vernon, or Voldemort. The comparison he had been avoiding hung between them. Harry looked away, uncomfortable with how close Hermione had come to the doubts that had been plaguing him. Had he become what he hated most? Used power to dominate, to bend another's will to his own. It's getting chilly, he said abruptly, standing up. We should head inside. Hermione clearly wanted to pursue the conversation further, but she respected his obvious desire to change the subject. As they walked back to the house, Harry tried to focus on the practical aspects of the upcoming Muggle hearing rather than the deeper ethical questions that had begun to haunt him. The next morning, Harry awoke early, his dreams troubled by vague, unsettling images, Vernon's face contorted in mechanical confession, Umbridge's toad-like smile, a long dark corridor ending in a mysterious door. He lay in Percy's old bed, listening to Ron's snores from across the room, and tried to organize his thoughts. Today he would meet Andromeda Tonks, apparently an expert in navigating both Muggle and magical legal systems. With her help, perhaps he could find a way through the tangled mess his impulsive use of Legilimency had created. But a deeper concern gnawed at him: what if Vernon's compulsion couldn't be reversed? What if the man spent the rest of his life in that strange, automaton-like state, endlessly confessing his wrongs? Harry had seen his uncle in many states over the years, angry, smug, fearful, triumphant, but never had he seemed as fundamentally wrong as he had under the influence of the Legilimency. It was as if Harry had broken something essential in the man's mind, reduced him to a hollow parody of himself. Is that what the Imperieuse curse felt like to cast? This disturbing mixture of power and revulsion? Pushing these thoughts aside with effort, Harry got up and dressed quietly, not wanting to wake Ron. The house was still as he made his way downstairs, the early morning sun casting long shadows through the windows. To his surprise, he found Ginny already in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a steaming mug of tea. "Morning," she greeted him, looking up from what appeared to be the Daily Prophet. "Couldn't sleep either?" "Not really," Harry admitted, helping himself to tea from the pot. "What are you doing up so early?" "Keeping track of what they're saying about you," she replied, gesturing to the newspaper. "Thought someone should monitor the propaganda." Harry grimaced. "That bad?" "Mixed," Ginny said, surprising him. "The front page is still pretty hostile: Potter escapes justice thanks to Dumbledore's influence, that sort of rubbish. But there's a small piece on page 6 that actually questions whether the Ministry is being too harsh on an underage wizard defending himself against an abusive guardian." She pushed the paper toward him. "Public opinion might not be entirely against you." Harry skimmed the article, noting that it carefully avoided taking a definitive stance while raising just enough questions to plant seeds of doubt about the Ministry's handling of his case. It wasn't much, but after weeks of unmitigated character assassination, even this small deviation felt significant. "Who wrote this?" he asked, finding no byline. Ginny shrugged. "Anonymous contribution. Dad thinks someone at the Prophet is getting nervous about putting all their eggs in Fudge's basket. If Voldemort does make a public move and proves you and Dumbledore right, they'll want to be able to say they were skeptical of the Ministry all along," Harry finished with a cynical snort. "Typical." They sat in companionable silence for a while, sipping tea as the house gradually came to life around them. Mrs. Weasley appeared first, seeming unsurprised to find them both already up, and busied herself making breakfast. By the time Mr. Weasley came downstairs, dressed for work, the kitchen was filled with the smell of frying bacon and eggs. "I'll be late tonight," Mr. Weasley told his wife as he quickly ate. "Meeting with Andromeda first, then bringing her here around noon. After that, I need to check in at the office. There's been a rash of exploding doorknobs in Hampshire that Perkins can't handle alone." "Exploding doorknobs?" Harry raised an eyebrow. "Nasty business," Mr. Weasley confirmed solemnly. "Muggle baiting, we suspect. The knobs wait until someone's about to touch them, then," he mimed an explosion with his hands, nearly knocking over his teacup in the process. "Arthur," Mrs. Weasley chided, though there was fondness in her exasperation. "Not at the breakfast table." "Right, sorry dear." He gulped down the last of his tea and stood. "Harry, be ready at noon. Andromeda is very precise about time." After Mr. Weasley departed, the morning passed slowly. Harry tried to distract himself with a game of chess against Ron, losing spectacularly, and then helping Mrs. Weasley degnome the garden. But as noon approached, his anxiety ratcheted up, his mind crowded with questions about what awaited him in the Muggle court system. At precisely 12 o'clock, the fireplace flared green, and Mr. Weasley stepped out, followed by a tall, elegant witch with heavy-lidded eyes and light brown hair streaked with grey. Harry was struck immediately by her resemblance to both Tonks and, more disturbingly, Bellatrix Lestrange, whom he had seen in Dumbledore's pensive memories. "Harry," Mr. Weasley said, brushing soot from his robes, "this is Andromeda Tonks." "Andromeda, Harry Potter." "Mrs. Tonks," Harry greeted her, extending his hand. Mr. Potter. Her handshake was firm, her dark eyes assessing him with an attorney's practiced evaluation. I understand you've created quite the jurisdictional tangle for yourself. There was no accusation in her tone, just a straightforward acknowledgement of the situation. Harry appreciated the lack of either condemnation or coddling. I didn't exactly plan it, he replied. A slight smile softened her aristocratic features. Few legal complications are ever planned, Mr. Potter. That's what makes them so vexing. She glanced around the crowded kitchen, where the entire Weasley family plus Hermione seemed to have materialized out of curiosity. Perhaps we could find somewhere a bit more private to discuss your case. You can use Percy's old room, Mrs. Weasley suggested. It's the tiddiest. Harry led Mrs. Tonks upstairs to Percy's meticulously organized bedroom, which still bore the imprint of its previous occupant despite his long absence, books arranged by subject and height, desk free of even a speck of dust, bed made with military precision. Your cousin speaks highly of you, Mrs. Tonks commented as she seated herself in Percy's desk chair, extracting a leather portfolio from her bag. Nymphadora says you have remarkable composure under pressure. Tonks said that. Harry couldn't hide his surprise. When did she? We're both members of the order, Mrs. Tonks explained matter-of-factly. Though I serve primarily in an advisory capacity rather than field operations. My background in magical muggle legal affairs has proven useful. She opened her portfolio, revealing several parchments covered in neat handwriting. Now, I've reviewed both the transcript from your ministry hearing and the preliminary reports from the Muggle authorities regarding your uncle. We're facing a complex situation that spans both worlds, with risks and opportunities on each side. For the next hour, Andromeda Tonks led Harry through a comprehensive analysis of his legal position. She explained the Muggle criminal and child protection proceedings that had been initiated against the Dursleys, the likely questions he would face from prosecutors and defense attorneys, and the carefully crafted cover story developed by the Muggle-worthy excuse committee to explain Vernon's strange behavior. As far as the Muggle authorities are concerned, she explained, your uncle suffered an acute psychiatric episode triggered by stress and guilt, causing him to confess to long-suppressed wrongdoing. The Muggle mental health experts who examined him have diagnosed a condition called dissociative state, which conveniently explains his mechanical demeanor and fixation on confession. And they believe that? Harry asked skeptically. Muggles are quite accustomed to unusual psychological phenomena, Mrs. Tonks assured him. More so than wizards in many ways. Our kind tends to attribute strange behavior to spells or potions, while Muggles have developed intricate frameworks for understanding the mind's natural malfunctions. So what happens to Vernon now? Is he, still under my influence? A shadow crossed Mrs. Tonks's face. That's one of our complications. The Legilimency compulsion you planted appears to be fading gradually, but its effects were significant enough that a ministry specialist was dispatched to evaluate him. Apparently, your command interacted with pre-existing guilt in a way that created a particularly powerful suggestion. You mean he actually did feel guilty about how he treated me? Harry couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. In all his years at Privet Drive, Vernon had never shown the slightest remorse for his treatment. At some level, yes, Mrs. Tonks confirmed. Most people, even those who commit terrible acts, maintain internal justifications that allow them to live with themselves. Your Legilimency stripped away those justifications, forcing him to confront the bare reality of his actions. It's actually quite remarkable for an untrained practitioner. Harry wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a warning. Will he recover? Go back to normal. Define normal, Mrs. Tonks replied dryly. Will he stop mechanically reciting his wrongdoings? Yes, that aspect is already diminishing. Will he return to treating you with the same callous disregard? Unlikely. The psychological impact of being forced to acknowledge his abuse will have lasting effects on his self-perception. She leaned forward, her expression grave. But you should understand, Mr. Potter, that this form of magical intervention carries serious ethical implications. To alter another's mind, to force self-awareness they aren't prepared to handle, it's not something to be undertaken lightly. There's a reason legilimency is so strictly regulated. I know, Harry said quietly. I didn't. I mean, I wasn't thinking of it that way when it happened. I just wanted him to stop lying. To admit what he'd done. Most significant magical transgressions begin with understandable motives, Mrs. Tonks observed. It's rarely malice that leads us across ethical lines, but pain, fear, or a desperate desire for justice. There was something in her tone, a personal understanding that went beyond professional knowledge, that made Harry wonder about her own history. As a black who had married a muggle-born and been disowned by her family, she must have faced her own moral crossroads. Now, she continued, returning to practical matters, the muggle hearing is scheduled for Monday at the Surrey County Court. You'll need to testify about your life with the Dursleys, the verified facts only, no embellishments or omissions that might raise suspicions. We've prepared a brief for you. She handed him several sheets of parchment. Memorize it. It contains the official narrative that aligns with what the Ministry has already established with the Muggle authorities. Harry scanned the document, which outlined a version of his life with the Dursleys that was remarkably close to the truth, minus any mention of magic. According to this account, Harry attended a prestigious boarding school in Scotland for academically gifted but troubled youth, explaining both his long absences and the Dursleys' resentment of his special treatment. This is, actually pretty believable, he admitted. The best cover stories always are, Mrs. Tonks agreed. They hew as closely to the truth as possible, requiring minimal fabrication. Less to remember, less to contradict. They spent another hour reviewing potential questions and appropriate answers, with Mrs. Tonks playing the role of both prosecutor and defense attorney with unsettling skill. By the time they finished, Harry felt mentally exhausted but better prepared for what lay ahead. One last thing, Mrs. Tonks said as she packed away her notes. Dumbledore asked me to discuss the Legilimency ethics lessons you'll be required to take at Hogwarts. Harry perked up. Do you know who's teaching them? Not officially, she admitted. But given the specialized nature of the subject and the limited pool of qualified instructors available to Hogwarts. She left the implication hanging. Snape, Harry groaned. Ron was right. Professor Snape, Mrs. Tonks corrected mildly, is one of the few accomplished legilimens in Britain who is not currently employed by the Ministry or, otherwise occupied. The slight pause suggested she was referring to Death Eaters. While I understand you may have personal reservations, his technical expertise is undeniable. He hates me, Harry stated flatly. All the more reason to master occlumency as quickly as possible, Mrs. Tonks replied with unexpected sharpness. If you're concerned about Professor Snape accessing your private thoughts, then motivation shouldn't be an issue. Put that way, Harry couldn't argue with her logic, though the prospect of Snape deliberately probing his mind remained deeply unsettling. I'll try, he promised reluctantly. Mrs. Tonks's expression softened slightly. Good. Mind magic is not to be taken lightly, Mr. Potter, as you've discovered firsthand. The consequences can extend far beyond what we initially intend, affecting both the subject and the caster in profound ways. Her words stayed with Harry long after she had departed, leaving him with the brief to study and a promise to meet him at the courthouse on Monday. Was he already being affected by his use of legilimency? The power had come more easily than he'd expected, and despite his regret over the unintended consequences, he couldn't deny a certain fascination with what he'd been able to accomplish. Was this how Tom Riddle had started? With curiosity, with justified anger, with small steps across ethical boundaries that seemed so reasonable at the time. The thought kept him awake late into the night. Monday arrived with unseasonable rain, fat droplets hammering against the windows of the burrow as Harry dressed in the muggle clothes Mrs. Weasley had purchased for his court appearance, a simple button-down shirt, dark trousers, and a tie that Ron helped him knot with unexpected skill. Bill taught me, Ron explained when Harry commented on it. Said a properly tied tie is the difference between being taken seriously and being dismissed in both wizard and muggle worlds. Mr. Weasley would be accompanying Harry to the courthouse along with Mrs. Tonks, who would meet them there. The ministry had arranged a special portkey directly to a secluded area near the Surrey County Court, minimizing the chance of Harry being seen by wizarding press or curious onlookers. "Remember," Mr. Weasley reminded him as they prepared to depart, "stick to the narrative we discussed. No mentions of magic, Hogwarts, or anything that might raise Muggle suspicions." "I know, Mr. Weasley," Harry assured him, though his stomach was churning with anxiety. "I've been hiding magic from Muggles my whole life." The portkey, an innocuous-looking umbrella, appropriately enough given the weather, deposited them in a small alley behind the courthouse. Mrs. Tonks was already waiting, dressed impeccably in a conservative Muggle business suit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized her aristocratic features. "Right on time," she approved, checking her watch. "The hearing is scheduled to begin in 20 minutes. Vernon and Petunia Dursley arrived 10 minutes ago, along with their solicitor." "Vernon's here?" Harry hadn't considered that he would have to face his uncle again so soon. "Is he still, you know?" "The compulsion has faded significantly," Mrs. Tonks assured him. "He's presenting as confused and distressed rather than mechanically confessional. The Muggle doctors are attributing it to recovery from his psychotic break, which works to our advantage." She led them around to the front of the courthouse, a modern brick building with none of the imposing grandeur of the Ministry of Magic. Inside, they passed through security and were directed to a waiting area where several people in formal attire were already gathered. Harry recognized a police officer who had been at Privet Drive and assumed the others were social workers or court officials. Andromeda approached one of them, a middle-aged woman with a clipboard, and spoke briefly before returning to Harry and Mr. Weasley. "The proceedings will be closed to the public due to your age," she explained. "That simplifies things considerably. The judge has already reviewed the police reports and medical evaluations. Today is primarily to establish the facts of your home situation and determine appropriate action." "And what happens to the Dursleys?" Harry asked, realizing he hadn't considered their fate beyond Vernon's confession. "That depends on the judge's findings, Mrs. Tonks replied. "Criminal charges are being considered separately, but today's hearing will determine issues like custody, potential foster placement, and visitation rights." "But I'm not going back there," Harry said firmly, a flutter of panic rising in his chest. "Not ever." "No, you're not," Mrs. Tonks assured him. "Dumbledore has seen to that. A special arrangement has been made that will satisfy both Muggle and magical requirements. You'll hear about it during the proceedings." Before Harry could ask for details, the door at the end of the hallway opened, and a court officer emerged. "The Dursley case is now being heard. Parties may enter." Taking a deep breath, Harry followed Mrs. Tonks into the courtroom, Mr. Weasley close behind him. The room was smaller and less formal than he'd imagined, with wooden benches instead of intimidating tiers like the Wisengamot chamber. At the front sat a severe-looking woman in black robes, her grey hair cut in a practical bob. To one side sat a court reporter with a stenotype machine, and various officials occupied other tables and chairs. And there, on a bench to the left, sat Vernon and Petunia Dursley. Harry's first glimpse of his uncle since the night of the Legilimency incident was shocking. Vernon had lost weight, his clothes hanging loosely on his frame, and his normally florid complexion had faded to an unhealthy pallor. He sat hunched forward, staring at his hands, while Petunia sat rigidly beside him, her face set in lines of bitter resentment. Neither looked up as Harry entered. "All rise for Judge Margaret Winters, presiding in family court," the court officer announced. Everyone stood as the judge settled herself, adjusted her glasses, and surveyed the room with keen eyes that reminded Harry uncomfortably of Professor McGonagall. "Be seated," she instructed. "This is a closed hearing regarding the minor, Harry James Potter, currently aged 15, and allegations of neglect and abuse perpetrated by his legal guardians, Vernon and Petunia Dursley." She glanced at her papers. "I see the minor is represented by Andromeda Tonks, court-appointed special advocate, and is accompanied by Arthur Weasley, designated temporary guardian. Is that correct?" "Yes," Your Honor, Mrs. Tonks confirmed, rising briefly. And the Dursleys are represented by Malcolm Pritchard. Is that correct? A thin man in an expensive suit stood. Yes, Your Honor. Very well. This hearing will proceed as follows. I'll first hear from the social services investigator, then from medical experts regarding Mr. Dursley's condition, followed by testimony from the minor and the guardians. As this is a family court proceeding, not a criminal trial, our focus is on the welfare of the child rather than punitive measures. Those considerations will be addressed in separate proceedings. She nodded to a stern-faced woman seated at a small table. Ms. Hartley, please present your findings. For the next 30 minutes, Harry listened as the social worker methodically outlined the evidence of his mistreatment, interviews with neighbors who had noticed Harry's ill-fitting clothes and malnourished appearance, school records documenting unexplained injuries and frequent absences, and most damningly, the cupboard under the stairs, which still contained a small, worn mattress and childish drawings on the wall when investigators examined the house. The subject minor was made to sleep in this cupboard for approximately 10 years, Ms. Hartley stated, displaying photographs that made Harry wince. Seeing his cramped former bedroom through official eyes made the abnormality of his childhood starkly apparent. Only when he began receiving acceptance letters from his current boarding school was he moved to a proper bedroom, apparently out of fear that the school authorities would discover the unsuitable living conditions. Harry glanced at Vernon, expecting rage at this public exposure, but his uncle simply stared at the table, occasionally nodding as if in confirmation of each damning detail. Next came a psychiatrist who had examined Vernon, explaining the dissociative episode theory in technical terms that seemed to satisfy the judge. According to his evaluation, Vernon had been suppressing guilt over his treatment of Harry for years, creating psychological pressure that eventually resulted in a breakdown and compulsive confession. While unusual in its presentation, the doctor concluded, the phenomenon is consistent with extreme psychological stress combined with underlying guilt. Mr. Dursley is now recovering, though he continues to express remorse in a more conventional manner. And is he considered a danger to himself or others? Judge Winters asked. Not at present, Your Honor. The compulsive behavior has largely resolved, and Mr. Dursley is now able to discuss his actions with appropriate emotional effect rather than mechanical recitation. Finally, it was Harry's turn to testify. As he took the seat indicated by the court officer, he felt an uncomfortable similarity to the ministry hearing. Once again, he was being judged for actions stemming from the Dursleys' treatment of him, once again forced to justify himself before strangers. Mr. Potter, Judge Winters addressed him directly, her expression neutral but not unkind. I understand this is difficult, but I need you to tell this court, in your own words, about your life with the Dursleys. Harry glanced at Mrs. Tonks, who gave him a reassuring nod. Taking a deep breath, he began with his earliest memories, the cupboard, the constant comparisons to Dudley, the punishments for any perceived abnormality. He described the neglect, the occasional physical discipline, the systematic effort to squash any sense of self-worth or individuality. They told everyone I was disturbed, dangerous, Harry explained, carefully following the narrative they had prepared. It made it impossible for me to make friends or for teachers to take my problems seriously. Everyone assumed I was the troublemaker, not Dudley, even when he and his gang would chase and beat me. And you never reported this mistreatment to authorities? The judge asked. I tried, once, Harry admitted. When I was 7. The school counselor called the Dursleys, and Uncle Vernon convinced her I was making it up for attention. After that. He shrugged. It seemed pointless. No one believed me over them. Judge Winters nodded, making a note. A common issue in these cases, she said, more to herself than to Harry. And your current school? Has anyone there noticed signs of abuse? My school is in Scotland, Harry replied carefully. It's a boarding school for special cases. The staff there have been more supportive, but I only see them during term time. Yes, I have the records here, Judge Winters confirmed, consulting her papers. A private institution for gifted students with behavioral or adjustment challenges. Your enrollment there appears to be one of the few positive aspects of this situation. She looked up at Harry, her expression softening slightly. Tell me, Mr. Potter, given the choice, what outcome would you prefer from these proceedings? Harry hesitated, caught off guard by the direct question. I don't want to live with the Dursleys anymore, he said finally. I'd like to stay with the Weasleys, if that's possible. They've been more of a family to me than the Dursleys ever were. I see. The judge turned to Mrs. Tonks. Ms. Tonks, I understand there's a proposal regarding alternative guardianship. Yes, Your Honor, Mrs. Tonks replied, rising. Arthur and Molly Weasley have expressed willingness to serve as Harry's legal guardians until he reaches majority. They have 7 children of their own, including a son who is Harry's closest friend at school. Their home has been inspected by social services and found suitable, and character references have been provided by the headmaster of Harry's school and other community members. The Dursley solicitor stood. Your Honor, if I may. My clients do not oppose this arrangement. In fact, given recent events, they feel it would be in everyone's best interest if Mr. Potter were placed elsewhere. A murmur ran through the courtroom at this unexpected capitulation. Harry glanced at Vernon and Petunia, finally making eye contact with his aunt. Her pinched face revealed a complex mixture of emotions, relief, resentment, and something that might almost have been regret. She quickly looked away. Judge Winters considered this for a moment. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, is this accurate? You're willing to relinquish guardianship of your nephew? For the first time, Vernon spoke, his voice hoarse but no longer possessing the mechanical quality Harry remembered. Yes, Your Honor. It's clear we haven't provided a proper home for the boy. For Harry. The use of his actual name, possibly for the first time in Vernon's life, startled Harry. I'm not well, and my behavior toward him has been inexcusable. The admission, freely given rather than compelled, left Harry speechless. Was this a lingering effect of the Legilimency, or had the forced confrontation with his own actions genuinely changed something in Vernon? I see, Judge Winters said, studying Vernon thoughtfully. And you, Mrs. Dursley? You're his blood relation. Do you also wish to terminate guardianship? Petunia's lips thinned to a nearly invisible line. It's for the best, she said tightly. The boy, Harry, has never fit with our family. The Weasleys understand him better. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly at this response, but she made another note before addressing Mrs. Tonks again. The paperwork for this guardianship transfer has been filed correctly? Yes, Your Honor. All necessary documentation is complete, pending your approval. And financial considerations? The Dursleys have been receiving support for the care of Mr. Potter, including an educational stipend for his specialized schooling. Those funds will be redirected to the Weasleys, Mrs. Tonks confirmed. Additionally, there's a trust fund for Mr. Potter's education that will continue to cover his school expenses directly. The judge reviewed the documents before her for several long minutes while the courtroom waited in tense silence. Finally, she looked up. Based on the evidence presented and the agreement of all parties, I am terminating the guardianship of Vernon and Petunia Dursley effective immediately. Temporary guardianship is awarded to Arthur and Molly Weasley, with a 6-month probationary period after which permanent guardianship will be considered. She turned to the Dursleys. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, while this proceeding is not determining criminal liability, I am referring this case to the Crown Prosecution Service for review. The evidence of neglect and emotional abuse is substantial, and there may be legal consequences beyond today's hearing. Vernon nodded dully, while Petunia's face went even paler. Furthermore, the judge continued, I am ordering a complete psychological evaluation for both of you, with mandatory counseling to address the concerning patterns of behavior revealed in this investigation. She turned to Harry. Mr. Potter, you will be required to participate in counseling as well, to address the trauma of your upbringing. Your new guardians will be responsible for arranging appropriate therapeutic support. Yes, ma'am, Harry agreed, though he had no idea how that would work with his return to Hogwarts imminent. "This hearing is adjourned," Judge Winters declared, striking a small gavel. "Ms. Tonks, please remain to complete the guardianship paperwork. Everyone else is dismissed." As people began to rise and gather their belongings, Harry found himself staring at the Dursleys, overwhelmed by the realization that they were no longer his legal guardians. After 14 years of misery at Privet Drive, it had ended not with a dramatic confrontation but with a judge's signature and Vernon's broken admission of failure. To his surprise, Vernon approached him, moving slowly like a much older man. Petunia tried to pull him back, but he shook off her hand, coming to stand awkwardly before Harry. "Boy, Harry," he corrected himself with visible effort. "I don't expect you to forgive what happened. What I did. But I..." He struggled, as if the words were physically painful to produce. "I'm sorry. For all of it." Harry stared at him, speechless. Was this genuine remorse, or some lingering effect of the Legilimency? And did it even matter? Years of mistreatment couldn't be erased with a simple apology. "Right," Harry said finally, unable to find more meaningful words. "Well." Vernon nodded as if this inadequate response was exactly what he'd expected. "Good luck at that school of yours," he said awkwardly. "I hope the Weasleys treat you better than we did." With that, he turned and shuffled back to Petunia, who was watching the exchange with narrowed eyes. She gave Harry one last, inscrutable look before guiding her husband toward the exit, their solicitor following close behind. "Well," Mr. Weasley said, coming to stand beside Harry, "that was unexpected." Was it? Harry wondered aloud. Or is it just the Legilimency still affecting him? "Hard to say," Mrs. Tonks replied, rejoining them after speaking with the judge. "Mind magic can have unpredictable long-term effects. But from my observation, what we just witnessed appeared to be genuine remorse, albeit heavily influenced by your initial intervention." She handed Harry a copy of the guardianship papers. "Congratulations, Mr. Potter. You are officially a ward of the Weasley family until you reach majority." Harry stared down at the document, emotions churning too rapidly to name. Relief, vindication, lingering anger at the Dursleys, gratitude toward the Weasleys, and beneath it all, a persistent unease about what he had set in motion with his use of Legilimency. "Thank you," he said to Mrs. Tonks. "For everything." "My pleasure," she replied with a small smile. "Though I recommend avoiding interjurisdictional magical incidents in the future, if possible. They create an inordinate amount of paperwork." Despite everything, Harry found himself laughing, the tension of the day finally breaking. "I'll do my best." As they left the courthouse, stepping out into the now sunny afternoon, Harry felt simultaneously lighter and heavier. A chapter of his life had definitively closed, but the consequences of his actions continued to ripple outward in ways he couldn't fully predict or control. "Ready to go home?" Mr. Weasley asked, placing a gentle hand on Harry's shoulder. "Molly will be beside herself waiting for news." Home. The Burrow. It wasn't perfect, the blood protection of Privet Drive was lost, creating new vulnerabilities, but it was a place where he was wanted, where he belonged. "Yes," Harry said firmly. "I'm ready to go home." The celebration at the Burrow that evening was jubilant but tinged with an awareness of what Harry's permanent presence meant, that the protections afforded by his mother's blood sacrifice were now compromised. While the Weasleys had placed additional wards around their property, they couldn't match the fundamental security of Privet Drive. "Dumbledore says it's an acceptable risk," Mrs. Weasley assured him as she heaped a third helping of treacle tart onto his plate. "You know who already has your blood, so the protection was already weakened. And you'll be back at Hogwarts in less than 2 weeks. Besides," Fred added cheerfully, "anyone trying to get to Harry here would have to get through all of us first." "And we're not exactly defenseless," George agreed, twirling his wand between his fingers. "Not to mention the Order members keeping watch," Ginny pointed out, then clapped a hand over her mouth, glancing guiltily at her mother. "Ginevra Weasley!" Mrs. Weasley exclaimed. That information is not for casual discussion. It's fine, Mum, Ron intervened. Harry already knows about the order. And it's not like he doesn't notice Tonks and Lupin taking turns patrolling the perimeter. Harry had indeed spotted both of them at different times, though they had clearly been trying to remain inconspicuous. It was simultaneously reassuring and unnerving to know he was being watched, even by friends. Well, Mrs. Weasley huffed, there's still no need to discuss security measures at the dinner table. Now, who wants more potatoes? Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Harry found himself alone with Mr. Weasley in the living room, the others having dispersed to various parts of the house. Mr. Weasley was reading a Muggle manual for something called a microwave oven, with fascinated concentration, occasionally muttering, "Ingenious," under his breath. "Mr. Weasley," Harry said hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, Harry," Mr. Weasley replied, setting aside the manual. "What's on your mind?" "Today, when Vernon apologized, do you think it was real? Or was it just my legilimency still affecting him?" Mr. Weasley considered the question thoughtfully. "I believe it was both," he said finally. "Your magical influence created a crack in the wall of self-deception he'd built, forced him to see his actions as they truly were. Now that the immediate compulsion has faded, he's left with that awareness, that truth he can no longer hide from himself. What we saw today was a man coming to terms with his own failings, perhaps for the first time. So I did permanently change him," Harry concluded, unsure how to feel about that reality. "Yes," Mr. Weasley acknowledged. "But change isn't inherently bad, Harry. You forced Vernon Dursley to confront the truth of his actions, a painful process, certainly, but potentially a transformative one. The question isn't whether you changed him, but whether that change might ultimately lead to growth." Harry considered this perspective. "I never thought about it that way. I was just worried I'd broken him. Done something as wrong as what he did to me." "The differences are significant," Mr. Weasley pointed out gently. "Vernon systematically mistreated a child in his care over many years, deliberately and with full awareness. You, in a moment of fear and anger, forced him to acknowledge that mistreatment. Neither action is without ethical complications, but they are not equivalent." The distinction helped ease some of the guilt that had been plaguing Harry since that night at Privet Drive. He hadn't become Vernon, hadn't used power to hurt for the sake of hurting, hadn't taken pleasure in another's suffering. His actions had been impulsive, driven by years of accumulated pain, and while the method was questionable, the underlying desire for truth and acknowledgement was fundamentally different from Vernon's cruelty. "Thanks, Mr. Weasley," Harry said sincerely. "That helps." "You're welcome, Harry. And perhaps it's time you started calling me Arthur, now that we're your legal guardians." He smiled warmly. "Though I suspect Molly will always be Mrs. Weasley to you, she insists on a certain maternal formality." Harry tried to imagine calling Mrs. Weasley Molly, and failed completely. "I'll work on it," he promised with a grin. Before they could continue the conversation, the fireplace suddenly flared green, and to Harry's surprise, Professor McGonagall's stern face appeared in the flames. "Arthur," she called. "Is Harry there? I need to speak with him urgently." "I'm here, Professor," Harry said, moving to kneel before the fireplace. "What's wrong?" McGonagall's expression was grave. "I've just come from a staff meeting at Hogwarts. It seems the Ministry has decided to take a more direct role in the school this year. Cornelius Fudge has appointed Dolores Umbridge as the new defense against the dark arts professor." Harry felt as if he'd been doused with ice water. "Umbridge? The woman from my hearing? She's going to be teaching at Hogwarts?" "Indeed," McGonagall confirmed, her lips pressed into a thin line of displeasure. "And that's not all. The Ministry has created a new position for her, High Inquisitor of Hogwarts, with authority to evaluate and potentially override other teachers' decisions." "But they can't just take over the school," Harry protested. "They can, and they have," McGonagall replied grimly. Educational Decree Number 22 gives the ministry power to appoint teachers if the headmaster cannot find a suitable candidate. And Educational Decree 23 establishes the inquisitor position. Mr. Weasley looked deeply troubled. This is a power grab, pure and simple. Fudge is trying to undermine Albus's influence at Hogwarts. Precisely, McGonagall agreed. And Mr. Potter, I must warn you, Madame Umbridge has made no secret of her particular interest in monitoring your activities. Given your recent legal troubles and your claims regarding you-know-who's return, you will be under intense scrutiny. Harry remembered Umbridge's toad-like face, her simpering voice, the naked dislike in her eyes when she looked at him during the hearing. The thought of her having authority over him at Hogwarts made his stomach churn. "What should I do?" he asked. "Be cautious," McGonagall advised. "Extremely cautious. Do not give her any excuse to take action against you. The probation from your hearing gives her leverage that she will not hesitate to use if provoked." "I understand," Harry said, though his mind was already racing with implications. Would Umbridge interfere with his required Legilimency ethics lessons? Would she monitor his communications, his movements around the castle? "Good," McGonagall said, though she still looked concerned. "I must go, there's much to prepare before term begins. Just remember, Potter, vigilance." The echo of Mad-Eye Moody's favorite warning was not lost on Harry. As McGonagall's face disappeared from the flames, he turned to Mr. Weasley, who looked equally troubled. "This complicates things," Mr. Weasley admitted. "Umbridge at Hogwarts means direct ministry oversight of you and Dumbledore. It's a clever move by Fudge. It's about controlling the narrative," Harry realized. "They don't want students believing Voldemort's back, and they definitely don't want me spreading the word." "Exactly," Mr. Weasley agreed. "And with your recent incident, they have the perfect pretext to keep you under close watch." Harry stood, pacing the small living room as he thought. "So I'll have the ministry watching my every move through Umbridge, Snape poking around in my mind for these ethics lessons, and Voldemort trying to get to me through my scar. Brilliant start to the year." "It does present challenges," Mr. Weasley acknowledged. "But remember, Harry, you won't be facing them alone. You have friends, professors who support you, and the Order watching out for you. And now, officially, you have us." He gestured around the burrow. "Your family." The word still felt new, fragile, when applied to Harry's situation. Family. Not by blood, but by choice, which, in many ways, meant more. "I know," Harry said, his determination solidifying. "And I won't let Umbridge or the ministry intimidate me into denying the truth. Voldemort is back, people need to know, and if they think putting a ministry spy in Hogwarts will shut me up, they don't know me very well." Mr. Weasley looked both proud and worried. "Just be smart about it, Harry. Open defiance will play right into Umbridge's hands. There are more subtle ways to resist." Harry nodded, though subtlety had never been his strongest quality. Still, he understood the need for caution. With his wand use restricted by probation and the ministry actively looking for reasons to discredit him, direct confrontation would be foolish. But that didn't mean he would be silent. Voldemort was gathering strength in the shadows while the ministry wasted time and resources persecuting Harry and Dumbledore. People deserved to know the truth, to be prepared for what was coming. And if Umbridge thought she could stop him from speaking that truth, she would discover what the Dursleys had learned over many frustrating years: Harry Potter was not easily silenced. "I'll be careful," he promised Mr. Weasley. "But I won't let her win." In that moment, as the implications of Umbridge's appointment settled over him, Harry felt something crystallize within him, a core of resistance, of determination that had been forged in the cupboard under the stairs, tempered by years of struggle, and now hardened by the ministry's attempt to silence him. They wanted him quiet, compliant, discredited. They would be disappointed. The end. Thank you for watching this video. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video.